Hello and welcome to this clean, historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The Bride's Hidden Treasure by Martha Gillcrest. Prologue. Cottonwood Creek, Montana, late 1800s. The warmth of Reed's General Store felt like a blessing on the crisp October morning. Silas Reed stood behind the counter, sorting through the morning's receipts while the wood-burning stove crackled cheerfully in the corner. Outside, the first frost of the season had painted the windows with delicate patterns. But inside, all was cozy and familiar. Winter would soon cloak Cottonwood Creek, but he was grateful that business had been good, and the town was growing fast enough to need several general stores now. He looked up from his paperwork as a loud thump came from the storage area out the back of the store. His heart sank as he heard Dora, his housekeeper and all-around savior, who helped with so much, muttering under her breath, "Lord, if only you could find it in your heart to keep these old joints of mine nice and supple, I sure would appreciate it." The sound of something heavy hitting the floor stirred him into action. Silas hurried through the doorway to find her struggling with a large burlap sack of apples, her face flushed with effort and frustration. The sack had tipped over, spilling bright red apples across the wooden floor, like colorful balls rolling into every corner. "Mrs. Washburn, what are you doing?" Silas rushed forward, his voice gentle but concerned. "You know I would have moved that for you. There's no need for you to struggle with heavy things." "It's nothing I can't handle," Dora replied, but her words came out breathless. She frowned and bent to retrieve the scattered apples, and Silas noticed the way her hands trembled slightly and how she favored her right leg with a faint limp. "Please, let me." Silas gently took her arm and guided her to stand upright. He could see the pain etched in the lines around her eyes, though she tried to hide it behind her usual determined expression. The tired slump in her shoulders told him more than her words ever would, even though she fought hard not to let it show. At 62, Dora Washburn had been a godsend after Marianne's death 2 years ago. She'd stepped in to help with 6-year-old Sophie and the household duties without being asked, claiming she needed something to keep her busy since her own husband had passed. But lately, Silas had noticed her struggling more and more with tasks that once seemed easy for her. "I can manage a sack of apples just fine," Dora insisted, though she made no move to stop him as he lifted the heavy sack with ease. "I've been lifting things longer than you've been alive, Silas Reed. You'd be surprised how heavy a basket of wet laundry can be, but I like nothing more than taking it out to hang on the line in the fall sunshine." She put her hands on her hips and shook her head. "You young folk forget we were young once too." "I know you have," Silas said, biting back a chuckle at her reminder, as he set the sack in its proper place. "You're still a force to be reckoned with, but that doesn't mean you need to keep doing it when help is available." Dora brushed off her apron and tucked a few gray curls back into place. Her limp was more pronounced today, he noticed, probably thanks to the change in weather. "A person needs to feel useful, you know," she said crisply. Silas began gathering the fallen apples, his movements efficient but unhurried. "You are useful, Mrs. Washburn, more useful than you'll ever know. Sophie and I both depend on you, and I thank my lucky stars you came to work for us." He realized she might get the wrong end of the stick. "Not that I'm saying it was a good thing you were widowed, just that I'm mighty grateful to have you helping." "For now," Dora murmured, and something in her tone made Silas look up sharply. He studied her face, seeing past the stubborn set of her jaw to the worry in her warm brown eyes. "What do you mean for now?" Nothing. Dora waved her hand dismissively. "Just an old woman's foolish thoughts. Come on, these apples won't sort themselves, and I've got a pot of coffee brewing in the back room." Silas wanted to press the matter, but he recognized the closed expression on Dora's face. She would share her concerns when she was ready, and not a moment before. Instead, He followed her to the small back room that served as both his office and a place for breaks. The coffee was ready, filling the small space with its rich aroma. Silas poured 2 cups and handed one to Dora, watching as she settled carefully into the worn wooden chair by the window. The morning light showed every line of weariness on her face, and she shifted on the cushion to get comfortable. As he sipped his coffee, Silas found his thoughts drifting to Marianne, as they often did in quiet moments like this. 2 years had passed since consumption had taken his wife, but sometimes the ache in his chest felt as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He remembered her final weeks with painful clarity, how she'd grown so thin that her wedding ring slipped off her finger, and how her blue eyes had seemed too large for her delicate face, the light slowly fading in them. She'd spent hours reading to Sophie, determined to fill their daughter's mind with as many stories as possible before she could no longer find the breath for words. And he could still picture their heads close together, bowed over a book in the lamplight. The memory that haunted him most was her last night. Marianne had been so weak she could barely lift her head from the pillow, but she'd reached for his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me," she'd whispered between fits of coughing, "promise me you'll carry on, for Sophie's sake. She needs her pa to be strong." "I promise," he'd said, though the words felt like stones in his throat. "Don't let grief consume you, Silas. Our little girl deserves a full life, not one shadowed by sorrow." Marianne's voice had been barely audible, but her eyes had held all the love and concern of a mother's heart. "She needs laughter in this house again, joy, hope for the future. I don't want her growing up in the darkness of mourning for too long." Those had been among her last coherent words. By morning she had gone, and Silas knew his life would never be the same again. Silas set down his coffee cup and rubbed his temples. 2 years. 2 years of trying to honor that promise of putting one foot in front of the other for Sophie's sake. Some days were easier than others, but lately he'd begun to wonder if he was truly giving his daughter the full life Marianne had wanted for her. "Pa! Pa! Look what Mrs. Washburn made for me." The sound of Sophie's voice, bright with joy, pulled Silas from his melancholy thoughts. His 6-year-old daughter burst through the back door, her fair hair flying loose from its braids and her cheeks pink from the cold morning air. She was barefoot again, despite Dora's constant reminders about shoes, and clutching a rag doll in her arms. "She's got a new dress, see?" Sophie held up the doll, whose simple blue fabric dress was clearly fashioned from scraps left over from one of Sophie's own gowns. "And Mrs. Washburn gave her yellow hair like mine, and look how pretty she is." Sophie pointed to the doll's face, where Dora had carefully embroidered a sweet smile and bright green eyes. Silas felt his heart lift at the sight of his daughter's excitement. Sophie's gap-toothed grin was infectious, and for a moment the small room seemed brighter. "She's beautiful, sweetheart. What are you going to name her?" "I thought maybe Mama Rose, because Ma used to love roses so much." Sophie's voice grew softer, more tentative, as if she wasn't sure whether mentioning Marianne would make her father sad. "I think that's a perfect name," Silas said, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "Your ma would have loved that." Sophie beamed and hugged the doll close. "Mrs. Washburn says I can help her make clothes for Mama Rose this afternoon, if I'm good and help with the dusting." "That sounds like a fine plan." Silas glanced over at Dora, who was watching the exchange with a warm smile. The older woman had a gift for making Sophie feel special and loved, something he treasured more than he could express. But as Sophie skipped back outside to play, Silas's smile faded. He watched through the window as his daughter settled under the maple tree in their generous plot of land beyond the building, talking to her new doll as if it could hear every word. She looked so small and alone out there, despite her cheerful chatter. How long could he keep holding things together like this? How long before his own loneliness and grief began to cast shadows over Sophie's bright spirit? The questions that had been lurking in the back of his mind for months suddenly seemed urgent and demanding. The bell above the store's front door chimed, signaling a customer's arrival. Silas straightened his shoulders and headed back to the main room, grateful for the distraction from his troubled thoughts. "Morning, Silas." Jake Holloway's booming voice filled the store as the weathered rancher stamped the dust off his boots. A wide grin split his sun-darkened face, and his broad-brimmed Stetson hat was pushed back on his graying head. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Morning, Jake. What can I do for you today?" Silas moved behind the counter, noting that his friend seemed unusually cheerful. "I need some nails for fence repairs, and my ranch hand is after me to pick up some of that fancy saddle soap you ordered last month." Jake leaned against the counter, his eyes twinkling with barely contained excitement. "But mostly, I came to share some news." Silas gathered the requested items, curious about what had put such a spring in Jake's step. "Good news, I hope?" "The best kind." Jake's grin grew even wider. "Remember how I took out an advertisement for a mail-order bride, and I've been corresponding with someone from the East? Well, I've only gone and proposed, and she accepted. My fiancé is coming to Cottonwood Creek next month. Esther McKinnon's Two Hearts Entwined matrimonial agency came through just like she promised." Silas paused in his gathering of supplies, surprised by a sudden pang of something that felt uncomfortably like envy. "That's wonderful news, Jake. You must be excited." "Excited? I'm over the moon." Jake laughed and slapped his hand on the counter. "Her name's Violet, and she writes the prettiest letters you ever did see. Got 5 of them at home, and I must have read each one a dozen times. She has experience with ranch life, but sadly lost her husband in a farming accident. She's looking for a fresh start, just like me." "I'm happy for you, Jake, truly." And Silas meant it, though the words felt strange in his mouth. It had been so long since he'd even considered the possibility of companionship that Jake's joy seemed to come from another world entirely. Jake studied his face with a kind expression. "You know, Silas, there's no reason you couldn't do the same thing. You're still a young man, and you've got that little girl to think about, a woman's touch around the house, someone to help with Sophie. It might be just what you both need." Silas shook his head automatically. "I appreciate the thought, Jake, but I'm not ready for anything like that. Sophie and I are managing just fine." "Are you, though?" Jake's voice was friendly but persistent. "Don't get me wrong, you're doing a fine job with your daughter. Everyone can see it. But managing isn't the same as thriving, if you catch my meaning." Before Silas could respond, he heard the soft clearing of a throat behind him. He turned to find Dora standing in the doorway to the back room, her coffee cup in her hands and a look on her face he couldn't quite read. "He's right, you know," she said quietly, her words carrying more weight than her soft tone suggested. Silas stared at her, caught off guard. Of all the people he'd expected to support Jake's suggestion, Dora Washburn was not one of them. He'd assumed she might feel threatened by the idea of another woman coming into their small household. "Mrs. Washburn, Sophie shouldn't grow up with only ghosts and chores," Dora continued, moving slowly into the main store area. "She needs laughter and music, and all the things that make a house feel like a home." Jake nodded vigorously. "Exactly what I was trying to tell him. That little girl needs a mother's love, and Silas here needs a companion. No offense, ma'am," he added quickly to Dora. "None taken." Dora set her coffee cup on the counter and fixed Silas with a steady gaze. "I've been thinking about this for weeks now, Silas. Watching you both, seeing how hard you're trying to be everything Sophie needs." "I thought you might object to the idea of someone else coming in," Silas confessed. Dora's expression softened. "Oh, my dear, did you think I was so selfish, so concerned with my own position, that I'd put it above what's best for you and Sophie?" "No, I didn't know what to think." "Well, let me make it clear." Dora straightened her shoulders with some of her old authority. "I'm not as nimble as I used to be. Silas, old age is creeping up on me, and my joints ache more every day, especially in the winter. I won't always be able to help you the way I do now." The admission hung in the air between them, confirming what Silas had been trying not to acknowledge for weeks. "But more than that," Dora continued, "Marianne wouldn't want you to stay grieving forever. She was a generous, loving woman who wanted nothing more than happiness for her family. Do you really think she'd want you to spend the rest of your life mourning her?" Silas felt his throat tighten. "She made me promise to carry on, for Sophie's sake." "Then carry on," Dora said firmly. "It's what she would have wanted, and deep down, you know it." Jake cleared his throat gently. Esther McKinnon's got a real gift for matching folks up. She takes time to understand what each person needs and what kind of partner would suit them. It's not just throwing two strangers together and hoping for the best. I wouldn't even know where to begin, Silas said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt something shifting inside him. A small crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. You begin by asking Esther to place an advertisement. Then, when the right lady replies, you write to her, Dora said, pressing home her advantage. Tell her about yourself, about Sophie, about what kind of life you're offering. Be honest about your situation. And don't forget to mention that store, Jake added. A woman wants to know she'll have security, that she won't be wanting for the necessities. Silas looked around his store, seeing it suddenly through a stranger's eyes. The shelves were well-stocked and organized. The building was solid and well-maintained. The living quarters, which were partly upstairs and partly behind the store, were comfortable, if a bit sparse. It wasn't a grand life he could offer, but it was an honest one. You built a home, Silas, Dora said softly, as if reading his thoughts. Don't you think there ought to be someone in it who brings it back to life? For the first time in months, Silas truly looked at his surroundings instead of just moving through them out of habit. The store was efficient and successful, but it lacked warmth. The living areas were clean and functional, but they felt empty. Even Sophie's cheerful presence couldn't fill all the quiet corners and shadowed spaces. I loved Marianne, he said finally, the words feeling rusty from disuse. Of course you did, Dora replied, and you always will. But love isn't a finite resource, Silas. Having more of it doesn't diminish what came before. Jake nodded in agreement. My first wife, God rest her soul, used to say that the heart has room for all kinds of love. The love I had for her doesn't make what I might find with Violet any less real or meaningful. Silas walked to the front window and looked out at the street. Cottonwood Creek was a good town, full of decent people who'd welcomed him and Sophie with open arms after Marianne's death. Children played in the dusty road, while their mothers chatted on front porches. Men headed to work with purpose in their steps. It was a community built on families, on the idea that people belonged together. Maybe Jake and Dora were right. Maybe he'd been so focused on not betraying Marianne's memory that he'd forgotten her actual wishes for him and Sophie. What else would I say in my letters? He asked, still facing the window. He heard the smile in Dora's voice when she answered. You'd say that you're a widower with a young daughter who needs a mother, that you run a successful business in a good town with good people, that you're looking for a Christian woman who understands that life isn't always easy, but believes it's worth living anyway. You'd mention that you're hoping to find someone who wants to build a future, not just escape a past. Silas turned back to face them, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Do you really think it could work? That someone would want to come all the way out here to marry a man she's never met? Happens all the time, Jake assured him. Women back east are looking for the same things we are. Security, companionship, a chance at happiness. And there are plenty of them who find the idea of frontier life appealing. The important thing, Dora said, moving closer to Silas, is that you'd be honest from the start. No pretending to be something you're not. No promises you can't keep. Just a good man offering a good life to a woman, brave enough to take a chance. Silas looked around the store again and imagined what it might look like with a womanly touch again. Flowers in the windows, perhaps? The sound of feminine laughter mixed with Sophie's giggles, someone to share the daily joys and concerns of running a business and raising a child. Mrs. McKinnon's office is just down the street, Jake said gently, right next to the church. She's usually there in the afternoons, working on her correspondence. I'm not saying I've decided anything, Silas said quickly, but maybe I could talk to her, just to understand how such arrangements work. Dora beamed at him. That's a wise first step. There's no harm in gathering information. The bell above the door chimed again as another customer entered, effectively ending their conversation. But as Silas went about the business of serving his customers and managing his store, his thoughts kept returning to the idea of following Jake's lead. That evening, after Sophie was tucked into bed and Dora had gone home to her own small cabin, Silas found himself standing in the main room of the store, looking at the shadows that gathered in the corners as the sun set. For 2 years, those shadows had seemed appropriate somehow, a reflection of the grief that had colored every aspect of his life. Maybe it was time to let in some light, he thought, with hope blossoming in his chest. Chapter 1. Baltimore, Maryland, late 1800s. The knock on the door came at dawn, sharp and official. Ellie Durant hastily pinned her chestnut-colored hair in a neat bun and clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she opened the door to find 2 men in dark coats standing on her narrow doorstep. "Hello," she said cautiously. A knock like that spelled trouble, but what else could she expect with the double life her husband, Vincent, lived? The older man removed his hat, revealing graying hair and tired eyes. "Mrs. Durant? I'm Officer Walsh with the Baltimore Police, and this is Officer McKenna, my colleague." He glanced past her into the cramped rooms in the tenement building she called home. "May we come in, ma'am?" Eleanor's heart began to pound. Vincent had been out all night again, and she'd fallen asleep waiting for him to return. "Has something happened to my husband?" "I'm afraid so, ma'am. We found Mr. Vincent Durant early this morning near the docks. He's been killed." The words hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor gripped the doorframe to steady herself, her knees threatening to give way. Killed? But how? Robbery, by all appearances. His pockets were turned out, and he was given a good going over. Officer Walsh stepped inside without waiting for permission, his sharp eyes taking in the humble furnishings and the crib in the corner where 6-month-old Clara slept peacefully. "We'll need to ask you some questions, Mrs. Durant." Eleanor's mind reeled. Vincent was dead? It didn't make sense that he was gone forever. Despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty that had marked their marriage, he was still her husband and Clara's father. "I don't understand." Vincent knew the docks well. He grew up there. He would never have gotten entangled in a fight. She thought inwardly that folks were too afraid of Vincent to challenge him, but didn't add that last part. She needed to find out what had happened. Officer McKenna, younger and less sympathetic than his partner, pulled out a small notebook. "What time did your husband leave yesterday evening, ma'am?" "He came home from his work at the docks and ate some stew. Our rooms aren't much, but he likes me to keep things nice. Then he went out again at around 6 o'clock. He said he had business to attend to." Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. She didn't mention that she'd long since stopped asking what kind of business kept Vincent out until all hours. Did he say where he was going? Who he was meeting? She shook her head. Vincent never told her anything about his work, and she'd learned not to ask. The less she knew, he'd said once, the safer they would all be. Besides, it was men's business, not for a mere woman to get involved with, spreading gossip about how he kept a roof over their heads. At the time, she thought he was being dramatic. Now, with him lying dead somewhere, those words took on a chilling new meaning. "Do you just have the one child?" Officer Walsh asked. His expression softened slightly as he glanced at the crib. "Yes, she's 6 months old." The officers asked more questions, their voices blending together as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Finally, they left, promising to keep her informed of their investigation. The moment the door closed behind them, Eleanor sank into the single wooden chair and let the tears come. Clara stirred in her crib and let out a grisly cry as she woke up, needing to be fed. "It's okay, sweetheart. Your mama is still here. We'll find a way to manage," she murmured, her voice cracking as she realized that wasn't exactly true. Eleanor wiped her tears away and lifted her daughter, holding her close. The familiar weight of the child in her arms was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. "What are we going to do now, little one?" she whispered against Clara's downy head. "What are we going to do?" The question hung in the air, and there was another knock on the door. This time, not as sharp. "It's only me, dear. Is everything okay? I saw you had a visit from the police just now." It was Mrs. Finnegan from down the hallway. She prided herself on being up to date with everything going on in the tenement. Eleanor sighed deeply as she opened the door a crack. "Vincent has been killed in a robbery," she blurted out, too shocked to dress it up differently. Mrs. Finnegan's mouth gaped open. Then she shook her head in disbelief. What is this city coming to? Mind you, he mixed with some dubious folks, I heard. There are plenty of rough types at the docks, and he liked to stay out late. She sniffed disapprovingly. Maybe you're better off without him, dear. A pretty young woman like you will soon be courting again, and you'll need help with the little one. Thank you, but we'll be fine. She closed the door and leaned against it. What did he get involved with this time? How will I care for Clara if we get thrown out of our rooms? The questions pulsed through her mind. Eleanor knew the news would spread like wildfire, but there was no point trying to stop it. Some neighbors would gloat because Vincent had always had an arrogant, impatient streak. Others, she hoped, would be kind enough to realize she and Clara were all alone now and needed to rely on people's generosity to get through this difficult time. Sure enough, the morning passed in a blur of neighbors offering awkward condolences and practical concerns. But amid her absent-minded replies, the most pressing matter that consumed her thoughts was that the rent was due in a week. Vincent's mysterious earnings had kept them fed and housed, but she had no idea where the money came from or if there would be any more. She had a few dollars hidden in a tin behind the flour sack, but it wouldn't last long. As the afternoon sun slanted through the grimy window, another knock came at the door. This time, Eleanor opened it to find a man she recognized, but had hoped never to see again. Anton Cawley stood in her doorway, his heavy-set frame filling the narrow space. He smelled of whiskey, and the whiff of tobacco clung to his wrinkled clothes. "What do you want?" She was done with being polite. "My daughter needs to rest, and I've had nothing but interruptions all day." "Mrs. Durant, sorry to hear about Vincent." He tried to arrange his features into what might pass for sympathy, but his dark eyes raked around the room and held no kindness. "I heard what happened from one of the fellows at the docks. Such a shame. Still, I suppose he had it coming. Vincent sure knew how to rile folks up the wrong way." Eleanor's hand tightened on the door handle. She'd seen Anton with Vincent a few times over the past year, usually late at night when they thought she was sleeping. There was something about the man that made her skin crawl. Something dangerous in the way he looked at her and spoke so casually about the death of her husband. "Thank you for your condolences, Mr. Cawley, but I'm not receiving any more visitors today." Anton stuck his boot out to prevent her from closing the door. "Now, that's not very polite, is it? Vincent and I were partners in business. Just because he's gone doesn't mean you get to ignore that fact. There are matters we need to discuss. I don't know anything about Vincent's business. He always told me he made a few deals with the warehouse owners and helped unload the ships. That's all I can say." It was the truth, and Eleanor clung to it like a shield. "What did you do together that's so important? Is he still owed some income from his former employers? I have rent to pay." It was a bold question to ask, and she regretted it as Anton's mouth pinched together in a thin line of anger. He pushed his way inside, ignoring her protests. His shifty eyes scanned the small room, taking in every detail. "You don't need to know what we were involved with, but what you need to understand is that Vincent had something that belongs to me and my associates, something valuable, and seeing as how he ain't around to return it, that responsibility falls to you." Eleanor backed away from him, her heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about. Vincent never brought his work home. Maybe not his regular work, but this was different." Anton's voice took on a menacing tone. "A few weeks back, Vincent helped himself to something that wasn't his to take. Money that belonged to other people, important people who want it back." "Money?" Her voice came out as a hoarse croak. "Vincent stole money? That can't be true. We barely had enough to cover the rent each month, and I always buy the cheapest food from the market." Anton's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Don't play innocent with me, Eleanor. You had to know what kind of man you married. Vincent ran errands for folks down at the docks. Folks who don't like being crossed." The pieces began to fall into place in her mind. Vincent's secretive behavior, the late nights, the way he sometimes came home with more money than seemed possible from honest work, but which he never spent on her and Clara. She'd wondered if it was from winning at games of cards, but never dared ask him. But now the truth hit her. Her suspicions that her husband wasn't entirely respectable were being thrown into her face, but she'd never imagined anything like this. Even if what you're saying is true, I don't have any money. Look around you. Eleanor gestured at their sparse belongings. Does this look like the home of someone with stolen money stashed away? I'm already scared about how I'll be able to afford to keep Clara warm in winter. And now I'll have to find work. But who will employ a woman with a daughter? I don't even have any family here to help. Anton's eyes narrowed. Vincent was clever. He wouldn't keep it here where it could be found easily, but he'd tell his wife where it was, wouldn't he? For safekeeping? He told me nothing, I promise on Clara's life. The truth rang clear in Eleanor's voice, but Anton didn't seem convinced. He stepped closer, and she caught the full force of the venom in his eyes. I'll give you 3 days, Eleanor. 3 days to remember where Vincent hid what he took. After that, well... He glanced toward the crib where Clara was sleeping. It sure would be a shame for that baby to grow up without a mama, too. I hear the orphanage always has childless families who would be happy to have a new baby of their own. No questions asked. The threat was unmistakable. Eleanor's blood turned to ice in her veins. Are you threatening my baby girl? I'm just saying things happen in neighborhoods like this. Accidents. Folks disappear. Anton moved toward the door, then turned back. 3 days, Mrs. Durant, to return what's rightfully mine. Don't make me come looking for you again. The moment he left, Eleanor rushed to the door and turned the key in the lock, though she knew it wouldn't keep out a man like Anton Colley if he was determined to get in. She lifted Clara from the cradle and held her close, her whole body shaking. Did I even know Vincent at all? How could he double-cross someone like Anton Colley, knowing how much danger it could put us in? The thoughts were troubling. That evening, as Eleanor sat by the window watching the street below, she heard voices in the hallway beyond her door. Mrs. Kowalski from the room next door was talking to Mrs. Brennan from across the hall. Terrible business about poor Vincent, Mrs. Kowalski was saying in her heavily accented English. But what's to become of the young woman and her baby? I heard tell from my nephew who works at the courthouse that there's talk of taking the child away. Mrs. Brennan replied in hushed tones. They're saying Eleanor Durant isn't in a position to raise her alone, especially if there's truth to what folks are whispering about her husband's dealings. What kind of dealings? The sort that gets a man killed in the night, if you catch my meaning. The authorities might decide that the baby would be better off in an orphanage or with a proper family. Who knows what sort of associates he had? She'll need to find work, and I doubt she can keep the baby safe. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Take Clara away? The very thought made her feel sick. She pressed her ear to the door, her heart thudding with dismay, and listened as the two women continued along the hallway until their voices faded. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She walked the floor, rocking Clara in her arms, trying to think of what to do. Anton Colley believed her husband was a thief and wanted money she didn't have. The authorities might take her daughter away, and she had no family to turn to, no one who could help her. As dawn broke over Baltimore, Eleanor found herself sitting at the small table, staring at Vincent's few belongings. Her eyes were gritty with exhaustion, and she'd been putting off going through them. But now she forced herself to look. There wasn't much. Some clothes, a few papers, and an old leather satchel he sometimes carried. Inside the satchel, she found bills and receipts, most of them meaningless to her. But at the bottom, she discovered something that made her heart skip. It was an old newspaper, folded open to a page titled The Matrimonial Times. One advertisement was circled. A business-owning widower with a young daughter seeks a God-fearing woman to help with housekeeping duties. If things progress well, there will be the opportunity for marriage and to become a mother to his 6-year-old daughter. Life in Montana offers fresh air, honest work, and new beginnings for the right woman. Write to Silas Reed, Reed's General Store, Cottonwood Creek, Montana. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the words again, and she tried to figure out why Vincent had circled it. Had he considered that they should all move to Montana to run away from the people he had crossed in Baltimore? Or had he been planning for only her and Clara to leave? Had he known that something like this might happen? Why didn't you confide in me, Vincent? Her whispered plea went unanswered. She would never know, but she had to think about the future. She needed to think what was best for her and Clara, never mind what other people might think was polite or right. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. It was too early for most folks to be about. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and she heard the soft scrape of someone trying the handle. Moving as quietly as she could, Eleanor crept to the window and peered down at the street. Anton Cawley stood on the sidewalk below, looking up at her building. He wasn't alone. 2 other men stood with him, both with the same hard look in their eyes. Fear shot through her like lightning. 3 days, Anton had said, but it had only been 1 night. Either he was getting impatient or something had changed. Eleanor looked at the newspaper in her hands, then at her sleeping daughter. Vincent had been many things, most of them not good, but maybe in the end, he'd tried to give her a way out. Perhaps that was the message she had to take from all of this. Moving quickly and quietly, she began to pack their few belongings into her old carpet bag. She stuffed her late mother's best shawl in the bottom, then a few changes of clothes for herself and Clara, her Bible, some food, and the small amount of money from the tin. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As she packed, a plan began to form in her mind. Ellie Durant needed to disappear. She would change her name to Ellie Warren. All anyone needed to know was that she was a respectable widow with a child seeking a new life in the West. The man in Montana was looking for a housekeeper, with the opportunity to perhaps become his wife and mother to his child, and she was looking for safety and a future for Clara. The footsteps on the stairs had gone quiet, but Ellie didn't trust the silence. She wrapped Clara in her warmest blanket and shouldered the carpet bag. At the door, she paused to listen. The hallway seemed empty. Taking a deep breath, Ellie unlocked the door and crept out. She had to get to the train station before Anton and his friends realized she was gone. She had to get to Montana, to Cottonwood Creek, to a man named Silas Reed, who might offer them the safety they desperately needed. As she walked quietly down the stairs with Clara in her arms, Ellie whispered a prayer. She was about to leave everything she'd ever known behind, traveling across the country under a false name to work for, and potentially marry a complete stranger. It was the most frightening thing she'd ever done. But as she thought of Anton Cawley's threats and the possibility of losing Clara, she knew she had no choice. Whatever lay ahead in Montana couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind in Baltimore. The morning air was cold and sharp as Ellie stepped out onto the street. In the distance, she could hear the whistle of a train preparing to depart. She hurried toward the station, not daring to look back at the only home Clara had ever known. Behind her, in the shadows of Fells Point, dangerous men were stirring. But ahead lay the promise of a new life, a new name, and perhaps, if she were very lucky, a new chance at happiness. The train whistle blew again, more urgently this time. Ellie quickened her pace, her carpet bag bouncing against her hip, and thankfully, Clara slept peacefully in her arms. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The old life of Ellie Durant was ending. The new life of Ellie Warren was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Baltimore post office was already bustling with morning activity by the time Ellie stepped through the heavy wooden doors. At the wooden counter, she asked for paper and ink, trying to keep her voice steady. The clerk barely glanced at her as he provided the materials, too busy sorting through the morning mail to pay attention to another customer. Ellie found a quiet corner and sat down carefully, shifting Clara to one arm while she composed her letter. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write. Dear Mr. Reed, I am writing in response to your recent advertisement in the Matrimonial Times seeking a housekeeper. I am a widow with a 6-month-old daughter, and I find myself in need of honest employment and a fresh start. I have experience managing a household and am willing to work hard. I understand you mentioned the possibility of marriage in the future, should things progress well, but I am primarily seeking a position where I can provide for my child and contribute to your household. I am traveling west immediately and should arrive in Cottonwood Creek in about a week, I believe. I know that usually There is a period of correspondence. However, I am more than happy to start work for you as soon as I arrive. I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I figure that this way we will have a better chance to get to know one another in person. If you feel you can't offer marriage at the end, I will understand and look for employment elsewhere. I hope this arrangement will suit both our needs. Respectfully yours, Mrs. Ellie Warren. She read the letter twice, making sure it struck the right tone. Professional and warm, honest about her situation without revealing too much. She sealed it carefully and approached the counter. You want to send it today? The clerk raised his eyebrows as she hesitated. I think so. It occurred to her that perhaps Silas Reed had already received lots of replies from hopeful young women, but she hastily pushed the thought away. Maybe she was being naive, but what choice did she have? It sounded like there were more opportunities out west, and clearly the idea of it had been on Vincent's mind. You think so, or no so? He gestured to the door behind him, which had just opened. A man in uniform walked in and headed toward the canvas bag containing letters that had already been paid for. He needs to take them now. Yes, I'll send it today, please. She slid a coin across the counter for postage, and he stamped the envelope and handed it to the mailman. Her heart skittered. There was no going back now. From the post office, Ellie made her way to the train station, glancing over her shoulder every now and again. There was no sign of Anton and his thugs, which she was grateful for. He probably thought she didn't have it in her to plan such an audacious escape, but she was happy to prove him wrong. Her carpet bag was heavy on her shoulder, and Clara was growing restless in her arms. The grand building seemed to dwarf her as she approached the ticket window. Where to, ma'am? The ticket agent looked at her with polite disinterest. Cottonwood Creek, Montana Territory, please. The words felt strange on her tongue, like she was speaking of a place from a fairy tale rather than her new home. Aha! And you're aware that the journey will take about a week, maybe more, depending on the weather and stoppages if the steam train breaks down? He studied her carefully. Are you traveling alone with the baby? Yes. Ellie kept her answer short, not wanting to invite more questions. That's a long journey for a woman on her own. You sure you got folks meeting you on the other end, or are you a mail-order bride? I'm expected, she said, which was mostly true. She paid for her ticket, feeling a spurt of anxiety as she realized how little money she had left now. As she waited for her train, Ellie found a bench in a quiet corner of the station. Clara was beginning to fuss, and she needed to feed the baby before they boarded. She tried not to think about Anton Colley and his threats or wonder if he'd already discovered she was gone. The train whistle blew, loud and mournful, and Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. She was really doing this, leaving everything she'd ever known to travel across the country to work for a stranger. All aboard for the westbound express, the conductor called. Ellie gathered her belongings and joined the line of passengers. As she handed over her ticket, she glanced nervously over her shoulder, half expecting to see Anton Colley pushing through the crowd toward her. But there were only ordinary travelers, families saying goodbye, and porters loading luggage. She found a seat by the window and settled Clara on her lap. As the train began to move, pulling away from the platform with a great hissing of steam, Ellie watched Baltimore disappear behind them. The tenement buildings gave way to farmland, and soon they were chugging through countryside she'd never seen before. Well, Clara, she whispered to her daughter, we're on our way to a new life. The first day of travel passed in a blur of unfamiliar sights and sounds. Clara seemed to enjoy the rhythmic motion of the train, sleeping more peacefully than she had in weeks. Ellie tried to rest, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vincent's face or heard Anton Colley's threatening voice. During a stop in Pennsylvania, she overheard two women talking about the dangers of traveling west alone. I heard tell that raids are still common on the western frontier, one said. And there are outlaws and all manner of rough characters. It's no place for a decent woman. Especially not one with a baby, the other agreed. What kind of desperation drives a woman to such extremes? Ellie pulled her shawl closer around herself and Clara, trying to make herself invisible. She knew exactly what kind of desperation drove such decisions, but she couldn't explain that to strangers. By the second day, as they rolled through the flat prairies, Ellie found herself sitting across from a kind-looking older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson. "Traveling far, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her eyes kind with grandmotherly concern. "Montana," Ellie replied carefully. "A frontier town called Cottonwood Creek." "My goodness, that is a long way. You have family there?" Ellie hesitated. She needed to practice her story to make it sound natural. "I have a position waiting for me as a housekeeper." "How wonderful. It's good to see a young woman making her own way in the world. And your husband, dear, is he already settled there?" The question she'd been dreading. "I'm a widow," Ellie said quietly. "My husband passed recently." She bit back how hard her marriage had been, and that Vincent seemed to think she was nothing more than a servant in the way he'd treated her. Mrs. Patterson's expression immediately filled with sympathy. "Oh, you poor thing, I'm so sorry. You must miss him dreadfully. How difficult this must be for you, traveling so far with a little one and grieving besides." "Thank you," Ellie managed. She hated lying to this kind woman, but the truth was impossible to tell. "What was your husband's name, if you don't mind my asking? Sometimes it helps to talk about our loved ones. I know there are many young ladies who travel west as mail-order brides, which I don't entirely approve of. You're seeking work which is far better in my opinion. Your husband, what did you say he was called? He would have been very proud of your courageous spirit." Ellie's throat tightened. For a wild moment, she almost said Vincent, but caught herself just in time. She needed to be consistent with her new identity. "William," she said finally. "William Warren." "William Warren. That's a good strong name. I'm sure he was an honorable man who loved you and your little girl very much." If only it were true, Ellie thought. If only she were really a grieving widow instead of a frightened woman running from her husband's crimes. Not to mention the relief at no longer wondering when the knock at the door would come. Now that she'd gotten some distance from her situation, she could admit to herself that she had often been afraid of Vincent and had always known deep down that he would bring trouble to their door. Mrs. Patterson continued chatting throughout the afternoon, sharing stories about her own family and asking gentle questions about Ellie's plans. Each question felt like a trap, forcing Ellie to build her false story piece by piece. "How did you hear about this position in Montana?" Mrs. Patterson asked as they watched the endless wheat fields roll by. "Through a newspaper advertisement," Ellie replied, which was at least partially true. "How modern! And the family you'll be working for, do you know much about them?" "A widower with a young daughter. He runs a general store in Cottonwood Creek." Ellie found herself warming to the subject, remembering the advertisement. "He seems like a decent man who needs help with his household." "A store owner? At least that's a respectable trade. You're very fortunate, dear. There are so many unscrupulous people who take advantage of women in difficult circumstances." The irony wasn't lost on Ellie. She was the one being unscrupulous, traveling under false pretenses to work for a man who had no idea what kind of trouble might follow her. As the train trundled westward, slowly gobbling up the miles, Ellie found herself thinking more and more about Vincent and their brief, troubled marriage. She'd been so young when they married, only 18, and without family to guide her. Vincent had seemed charming and worldly, but she'd quickly learned that his charm masked a darker nature. The isolation had been the worst part. Vincent didn't want her making friends or talking to the neighbors more than necessary. He said people asked too many questions, that it was safer to keep to themselves. At the time, she'd thought he was just protective. Now she understood he'd been keeping her from discovering the truth about his activities. People had a way of wanting to chat and be neighborly, which was perfectly normal when there was nothing to hide. But now, she suspected that much of Vincent's life had been a charade. She had fallen in love with the idea of him, without ever really getting to know him. She remembered the night she'd first suspected something was wrong. Vincent had come home with torn clothes and scraped knuckles, claiming he'd fallen down some stairs at the docks. But she'd heard him talking in his sleep, muttering about money and threats, and someone named Big Murphy, who wouldn't be reasonable. When she'd asked him about it the next morning, Vincent had flown into a rage, accusing her of spying on him and questioning his word. She'd never asked again, but the fear had taken root in her heart and grown stronger with each passing month. Clara began to fuss as evening approached on the third day, and Ellie realized her baby was developing a slight fever. She felt the familiar panic of a new mother facing a crisis alone. Clara's cheeks were flushed, and her forehead felt warm to the touch. "Is the little one all right?" Mrs. Patterson asked with concern. "No, I think she's sickening for something," Ellie said, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. She felt tears prick the back of her eyes as the enormity of what she was doing finally sank in. "Poor little lamb, let me help you." Mrs. Patterson moved to sit beside Ellie, her experienced hands gentle as she examined Clara. "She's not too warm, just a little feverish. Babies get these minor ailments when they're traveling. The change in routine and all the different air can upset their delicate systems. I worry that I might not get everything right." Mrs. Patterson chuckled. "That's normal, dear. Show me any mother, and I'll wager she thinks she'll make mistakes. Babies are more resilient than we think." Throughout the long night, Ellie nursed Clara through her restless sleep, rocking her gently and murmuring soft reassurances. Mrs. Patterson stayed nearby, offering advice and support. Then, as the sun rose in the east, sending pinky gold rays of light into the carriage, Clara waved her chubby fists and gave her a gummy smile. The brief sickness had passed, and Ellie could breathe a sigh of relief again. "You're a good mother, dear," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "That little girl is lucky to have you." The words brought tears to Ellie's eyes. She'd felt like such a failure as a wife, unable to make Vincent happy or keep him from his dangerous associates. But maybe she could succeed as a mother. Maybe she could give Clara the safe, stable life she deserved. "I try my best," Ellie whispered. "That's all any of us can do. And sometimes our best efforts lead us to exactly where we need to be, even if the path ahead doesn't seem to make logical sense at the time." Ellie wondered whether the old lady had seen through her fabricated story. If so, she was kind enough not to challenge her over it. Mrs. Patterson got off the train at the next stop, but not before pressing a small pouch into Ellie's hands. "It's just a couple of dollars to help you along your way. I know what it's like to start over with very little." "I can't accept this," Ellie protested, but Mrs. Patterson was already gathering her belongings. "Nonsense. We women must help each other when we can. God bless you and that precious baby." Ellie watched through the window as a large, happy family met Mrs. Patterson on the platform. Children rushed to hug her, and a younger woman, who must have been her daughter, embraced her warmly. It was the kind of loving reunion Ellie had never experienced and might never know. But perhaps she could build something like that for Clara. Perhaps in Cottonwood Creek, they could find their own version of family and belonging. The final stretch of the journey took them through the dramatic landscape of Montana Territory. Ellie had never seen mountains like these, towering peaks capped with snow even in October. The train wound through valleys and across bridges that seemed to span impossible distances. Other passengers pointed out landmarks and shared stories of frontier life. Some spoke of the dangers and hardships, but others talked about the freedom and opportunities that awaited those brave enough to seek them. As they approached Cottonwood Creek, Ellie felt her nervousness return in full force. What if Silas Reed took one look at her and decided she wasn't suitable? What if her letter hadn't reached him in time, even though she had paid extra for it to go by the Pony Express? What if he'd changed his mind about needing a housekeeper? The train began to slow, and the conductor walked through the cars announcing their arrival. "Cottonwood Creek! Next stop, Cottonwood Creek!" Ellie gathered her few belongings and lifted Clara, who was awake and alert, her bright blue eyes taking in the new surroundings with curiosity. Through the window, she could see a small platform and a collection of wooden buildings that made up the town. It looked peaceful and clean, very different from the crowded, dirty streets of Baltimore. Children played while their mothers chatted nearby. Cowboys sat astride horses, trotting along the street between other wagons, and she was pleased to see that the town was bigger than many they had traveled through. The train came to a stop with a great hissing of brakes and steam. Ellie took a deep breath, hitched Clara on her hip, shouldered her carpet bag, and stepped carefully down onto the platform. She was here, in Cottonwood Creek, Montana, hundreds of miles from everything she'd ever known. The mountain air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees and wood smoke. It was so quiet compared to Baltimore that she could hear individual voices, the sound of horses moving in the street, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolling the hour. Clara made a small sound of wonder, as if she, too, sensed they were somewhere very different from the cramped tenement rooms where she'd been born. Ellie looked around the platform, searching for someone who might be Silas Reed. Had her letter arrived? Was he expecting her? The uncertainty was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to stand tall and project confidence she didn't feel. Whatever happened next, she and Clara were far from Anton Colley and the dangers of Baltimore. They had a chance at a new life, and Ellie was determined to make the most of it. Chapter 3. Cottonwood Creek, Montana. Ellie stood on the platform, feeling very small under the vast Montana sky. Clara stirred in her arms, making soft baby sounds as she took in the new surroundings. The mountain air was crisp and clean, so different from the smoky, crowded atmosphere of Baltimore that Ellie almost felt dizzy breathing it. She scanned the faces of the people on the platform, looking for someone who might be Silas Reed. A few men were clearly there to meet passengers, but none of them seemed to be looking for her. Her heart began to sink. What if her letter hadn't arrived? What if he'd changed his mind about needing a housekeeper? Mrs. Warren? Ellie turned at the sound of her assumed name, spoken in a deep, quiet voice. A tall man approached her, removing his hat to reveal dark blonde hair and hazel eyes. He was broad-shouldered and looked to be in his mid-30s, with a neat beard and the sturdy build of someone accustomed to physical work. His clothes were simple but clean: work shirt, suspenders, and well-worn but well-maintained boots. "Yes, I'm Ellie Warren," she replied, grateful that her voice came out steady. "Silas Reed," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I received your letter just yesterday, which caught me off guard as I figured I might not get any replies. It's not every day someone will agree to look after a widower and his daughter. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." There was something immediately reassuring about him, which helped calm her nerves. His manner was courteous without being familiar, and his eyes held a kindness that reminded her of Mrs. Patterson from the train. Unlike Vincent, who had always seemed to be looking past her or through her, Silas Reed looked directly at her when he spoke, as if her words actually mattered. "The journey was long, but we managed well enough," Ellie said. "This is my daughter, Clara. She's 6 months old, but no trouble, I promise. She's an easy baby." Silas's expression softened as he looked at the baby. "She's beautiful. May I?" He reached for Ellie's carpet bag, unhooking it from her arm, and she gratefully let him take its weight. The simple courtesy made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Vincent had never carried anything for her, not even when she was heavily pregnant. "My store is just down the street," Silas said, gesturing toward the bustling town beyond the railroad station. It's fortunate that Cottonwood Creek is growing fast with new arrivals every week. There was already a general store in the center of town, but the owners were very welcoming when I suggested having another one at the far end of town. They said it would help them out, so they could take time off now and again. That sounds like a good spirit of cooperation. Ellie thought about how Vincent always grumbled about the warehouse owners he dealt with. He liked to see the worst in everyone, which often led to arguments, as she preferred to think that most folks were good people if you gave them the benefit of the doubt. "It's not too far. My place is just along the main street toward the road that leads to Willow Brook, which is the next town over. We can get you and Clara settled, and then we can discuss the arrangements." As they walked, Ellie took in her new surroundings. The town was small after Baltimore, but it appeared prosperous and well-maintained. Women and children meandered between the different stores, while many of the men nodded politely to Silas as they passed, and several cast curious but not unfriendly glances at Ellie. "That's the church," Silas said, pointing to a white-painted building with a simple steeple. "Pastor Fernandez preaches a good sermon, and there are plenty of social opportunities to help you meet folks. with fundraisers and the sewing circle. And there's the school up yonder. It's had a couple of new buildings added recently, now that there are so many families making the town home. It looks wonderful. His voice changed slightly as she caught sight of the plain sign that signaled they had arrived at Reed's General Store. This is my home and business. It's not grand, but I hope to improve it over time. He sounded slightly nervous, and she realized this was just as hard for him as it was for her. She smiled up at him, feeling drawn to reassure him. If you saw the neighborhood I came from, this is utterly charming by comparison, more lovely than I dared to hope. I think Clara will be lucky growing up in this town. The general store was a solid 2-story building with large windows displaying various goods. The painted sign above the door was neat and professional. As Silas opened the door for her, Ellie heard the cheerful tinkle of a bell announcing their arrival. The store was warm and welcoming, with shelves neatly organized and a pot-bellied stove crackling in one corner. The smell of coffee and dried goods filled the air, along with something that might have been fresh bread baking nearby. Everything was clean and orderly, clearly run by someone who took pride in his business. "Mrs. Washburn?" Silas called toward the back of the store. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Warren." He rubbed his jaw. "I didn't explain in my advertisement that Dora is my housekeeper, but she wants to ease up on some of her work." An older woman emerged from what appeared to be a back room, and Ellie's heart sank slightly. Mrs. Dora Washburn was a stout woman with graying curls and warm brown eyes behind wire spectacles. She walked with a slight limp, but moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of her domain. Ellie felt a flash of panic. How could she possibly work as a housekeeper when there was clearly already someone fulfilling that role? Had she misunderstood the situation? Was she intruding on this woman's position? "So you're the young lady who wrote about the housekeeping position," Mrs. Washburn said, looking Ellie up and down with sharp but not unkind eyes. "And this must be your little one." "Yes, ma'am," Ellie replied, feeling more nervous by the moment. "I hope I haven't misunderstood the arrangements, Mr. Reed. If you already have help—" Mrs. Washburn waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry, you haven't misunderstood anything. I've been telling Silas for weeks that this household needs more help than these old hands can provide." She gestured to her hands, and Ellie noticed the swollen red knuckles, which indicated arthritis. "I'm getting too old to be managing everything on my own, and little Sophie needs more attention than I can give her while keeping up with the cooking and cleaning." Relief flooded through Ellie. "I'm very willing to work hard, Mrs. Washburn. I don't want to step on your toes or interfere with how you've been managing things." To Ellie's surprise, Mrs. Washburn's stern expression melted into a warm smile. "Step on my toes? Mrs. Warren, you'll be saving my back and my knees. I've been praying for someone exactly like you to come along, and you must call me Dora." "Let me show you upstairs," Silas said. "There are a couple of rooms out the back, but the main living quarters are above the store. If things go well, I hope to build a separate log cabin on my land behind the store one day. But until then, well, it suits us for now." They climbed a narrow but sturdy staircase to the second floor. The living area was modest but comfortable, with a sitting room, kitchen, and 4 bedrooms. Everything was clean, but had the slightly neglected feel of a household managed by someone whose energy was waning. Mrs. Washburn used to go home in the evenings as her own cabin is nearby. But she's agreed to take the smaller bedroom and stay here while you settle in," Silas explained. "And my daughter Sophie sleeps in the small bedroom next to mine. That leaves the one at the back with a nice view of the mountains for you. I usually keep it for storage, and it can be chilly in the winter, but I'm sure once it's lived in, it will feel better." "Oh, I don't want you to change things on my account," Ellie protested. "Nonsense," Dora said firmly, as she huffed up the stairs behind them. "I would have offered for you to stay with me, except there's no room, and it's not proper for a young woman to be living in a household with a man unless there's another woman present for propriety. I sleep here now and again, anyway, because Sophie sometimes has nightmares, and it's easier than walking back and forth from my own cabin in town." As if summoned by the mention of her name, A small figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Sophie Reed was a delicate 6-year-old with fair hair pulled back in braids and wide green eyes that seemed almost too large for her face. She was barefoot despite the October chill, and her simple dress looked as though it had seen better days. Sophie stopped at the sight of Ellie and Clara, suddenly shy. She pressed herself against the wall, peeking around her father with curiosity, but not speaking. "Sophie, come meet Mrs. Warren," Silas said gently. "She's going to be helping us around the house." Sophie crept closer, her eyes fixed on Clara. "Is that a baby?" she whispered. "Yes, this is my daughter, Clara," Ellie said, kneeling down so she was at Sophie's eye level. "She's 6 months old. Would you like to see her?" Sophie nodded eagerly, and Ellie carefully adjusted Clara so the little girl could get a better look. Clara chose that moment to open her bright blue eyes and gurgle happily, reaching out with one small fist. "She's trying to say hello to you," Ellie said softly. Sophie's face lit up with wonder. "Can I touch her hand?" "Of course, she would like that." Ellie guided Sophie's small finger to Clara's palm, and the baby immediately grasped it with surprising strength. "She likes me," Sophie exclaimed, her shyness forgotten. "Pa, the baby likes me." Silas was watching the interaction with an expression Ellie couldn't quite read. There was warmth there, and something that might have been relief. "I can see that," he said quietly. "Can I help take care of her?" Sophie asked eagerly. "I've never had a baby sister before." Ellie felt the heat rising up her cheeks. Sister? That implied she was going to marry Silas, which was far from certain, considering they had only met a short while earlier. Silas cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Warren and Clara aren't here as family," he explained. "They're here to help out with the housekeeping and perhaps in the store." "I'm sure Mrs. Warren would appreciate your help," Dora interjected with a meaningful look between her and Silas. "Little girls can be very good helpers with babies." "I would love your help, Sophie," Ellie said, and meant it. The child's immediate acceptance of Clara touched something deep in her heart. "But you must promise to always ask before picking her up or feeding her anything." "I promise," Sophie said solemnly. "I'll be the best big sister, helper, ever." As the afternoon wore on, Silas and Mrs. Washburn showed Ellie around the rest of the premises and began clearing out the small storage room that would become her bedroom. Sophie's old crib was perfect for Clara, and she noticed that he fell quiet when he moved it. She wanted to ask about his first wife, but refrained, in the same way she hoped that Silas wouldn't ask too many questions about Vincent. "I know this is all very sudden," he said as they worked. "If you need time to settle in before taking on too many duties, please say so." "I'm grateful for the work," Ellie replied honestly. "Clara and I need a place to belong." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than she intended, because Silas paused in his work and looked at her directly. "You'll have that here, Mrs. Warren, for as long as you need it." Later that evening, after a simple but hearty supper, Ellie found herself helping Dora with the dishes, while Silas read to Sophie in the comfortable armchair in front of the fire. The older woman worked efficiently despite her obvious joint pain, and Ellie tried to observe her methods without being obvious about it. "You don't need to be so nervous, Ellie," the old lady said suddenly. "I can see you watching me, trying to figure out how things are done around here." Ellie flushed. "I don't want to do anything wrong. I need this position to work out." Mrs. Washburn studied her face carefully. "You're running from something, aren't you?" Ellie's hands stilled in the dishwater. "I don't know what you mean." "I've seen that look before," Mrs. Washburn said gently. "The way you keep glancing toward the door. The way you hold that baby like someone might try to take her from you. You've got the look of someone who's been hurt and is still expecting more hurt to come." Tears pricked at Ellie's eyes. "I just want to make a new start for Clara and myself." "And you shall," Mrs. Washburn said firmly. "I don't need to know what you're running from. What matters is who you are now and how you treat the people in this house. And from what I can see, you're a good mother and a hard worker. That's enough for me." The kindness in the older woman's voice nearly undid Ellie completely. "Thank you," she whispered. "Besides," Dora continued with a slight smile, "I can see the way Silas looks at you and that baby. That man's been carrying grief and loneliness for too long since Marianne's passing. Sophie needs a mother's influence, and he needs..." Well, he needs to remember that life is for the living. I'm here to work, Ellie said quickly. The advertisement mentioned the possibility of marriage in the future, but I'm not ready for anything like that. I understand, dear, but life has a way of changing our plans when we least expect it. Dora handed her a towel to dry her hands once she washed the last plate. I never expected to be widowed when the Lord took my Albert before his time. And I always thought I'd have a large family, but we weren't fortunate in that way. That's why I value helping Silas with Sophie. I could use a friend or two, Ellie murmured. I lost my parents when I was barely 16. I believe that's why it was meant to be that you saw Silas's advertisement. Dora's eyes twinkled as she smiled. He's already happier since you arrived. The next morning, Ellie woke early to Clara's quiet babbling in the crib. Since being cleared, the room was plenty big enough for both of them, with the crib in the corner, a narrow bed, and a chest for her belongings. She opened the drapes and sent up a silent prayer of thanks as she took in the view of rooftops, green pastures, and the mighty mountains beyond, clad with trees on the lower slopes. The fall colors of the leaves were breathtaking, and she let out a happy sigh of contentment. After feeding Clara, Ellie made her way to the kitchen, hoping to start breakfast and show her willingness to work. She found Dora already there, moving slowly as she prepared coffee. Let me help you with that, Ellie said, hurrying forward. Bless you, dear. My knees are particularly stiff this morning, which usually means we're in for a cold spell. Ellie took over the breakfast preparations, and Dora sank gratefully into a chair. You know, the older woman said, I think this arrangement is going to work out very well indeed. By the time she'd cooked oatmeal, bacon, and eggs, and made a fresh pot of coffee, Silas sniffed appreciatively as he came into the kitchen, closely followed by Sophie. Good morning, Mr. Reed. I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I don't mind at all, he said, settling into his chair. It smells wonderful, and call me Silas. Mr. Reed sounds far too formal. As they ate together, Ellie felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense of belonging to a family. Sophie chattered about her plans for the weekend, which involved collecting some new chickens from a neighbor so they could have fresh eggs, and Silas explained that although they didn't have a ranch, they had enough land to keep a milking cow and have chickens. Dora chimed in with talk of sewing a new quilt for Ellie's bed, which Ellie eagerly offered to help with. It was a simple conversation, but it filled her heart with joy. After breakfast, Silas prepared to open the store for business. Would you like to see how things work down there? He asked Ellie. You might be able to help during busy times. Ellie followed him downstairs, leaving Clara happily lying on the rag rug under Dora's watchful eye, while Sophie skipped along beside them. The store was already showing signs of morning activity, with a few early customers waiting on the front porch. I usually handle the customers while Dora manages the household duties, Silas explained. But if you're comfortable with it, you could help with both. Ellie nodded, though she felt nervous. She'd never worked in a store before, and she was afraid of making mistakes that might embarrass Silas or cost him business. The first few customers were patient with her inexperience. She tried to help by restocking shelves and organizing inventory, but her nervousness made her clumsy. She knocked over a display of canned goods and dropped a sack of flour, creating a small cloud of white dust. I'm so sorry, she said, flustered, as she tried to clean up the mess. It's okay, Silas said calmly. Everyone has accidents when they're learning something new. His patient response only made Ellie more determined to prove herself capable. She watched carefully as he interacted with customers, noting his friendly but professional manner. He knew everyone by name and asked about their families and concerns. Mrs. Fairchild, how is your husband's back feeling? He asked one older woman. Better. Thank you for asking, and thank you for ordering that special liniment. It's helped him tremendously. Ellie was impressed by the way Silas genuinely cared about his customers' needs. It was so different from Vincent's attitude toward people, which had been calculating and self-serving. As the day progressed, Ellie began to feel more confident. She learned where different items were located and started to understand the rhythm of the store. When she successfully helped a customer find what they needed, Silas gave her an approving nod that warmed her more than it should have. Better still, Silas had set up a small, secure area for Clara in the corner of the store, behind the counter, with a shallow wooden box lined with soft blankets so she could sleep while Ellie worked in the store rather than being upstairs all the time. During a quiet moment, she found herself watching him interact with Sophie, who had come downstairs to play near the store counter. He was patient and loving with his daughter, answering her endless questions and including her in small tasks that made her feel important. "Pa, can I show Clara and Mrs. Warren my favorite hiding spot later?" Sophie asked. "If Mrs. Warren says it's all right," Silas replied. "But remember, babies can't go everywhere big girls can go." "I'll be very careful," Sophie promised solemnly. Watching them together, Ellie felt a pang of sadness for what Clara would never have with Vincent. But there was also a growing hope that perhaps, in this place with these people, her daughter might find the kind of father figure she deserved. As the day ended and they closed the store, Silas offered to carry Clara back upstairs. The way he handled her so confidently tugged at her heartstrings. "You did well today," he said quietly. "I know it's not easy, learning everything at once." "Thank you for your patience," Ellie replied. "I want to earn my place here." "You already have," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a warmth in his hazel eyes that she hadn't expected, and she felt her heart skip in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. Ellie wasn't ready for such feelings. She'd come here seeking safety and employment, not romance. But as she watched Silas Reed's gentle manner with Clara and his daughter, she began to understand what Dora had meant about life changing when it was least expected. She felt a pang of guilt for not mourning Vincent's passing more. But truth be told, his heartless attitude toward her, and then Clara had created a wall around her heart, out of self-preservation. She wasn't expecting to find love in Cottonwood Creek. As long as coming west meant Clara would never be taken from her, that was all that mattered. More to the point, Ellie didn't dare get her hopes up that Silas might ever want more than a housekeeper, despite what her advertisement had said. It was the safest way to avoid getting hurt twice, she told herself. Chapter 4. The air was crisp, and the sky was bright blue as Ellie made her way to the small chicken coop behind Reed's General Store, with Clara bundled warmly in her arms. 4 weeks had passed since her arrival in Cottonwood Creek, and she had settled into a routine that felt as though she had been there much longer. "Good morning, ladies," she said cheerfully to the hens as she unlatched the gate and opened the coop to let them out. The chickens clucked and fluttered, but they'd grown accustomed to her daily visits. It had been a family affair, involving all of them to build the new coop. And they already had more eggs than they needed, which meant there were extras to sell in the store. Clara gurgled happily on her hip as Ellie gathered the warm eggs in her basket, her bright blue eyes following the movement of the chickens. At 7 months old now, she was becoming more alert and curious about everything around her. "Mrs. Warren," Sophie's voice called from the back door of the store. "Is it time to milk the cow?" "Just finishing up here," Ellie called back, securing the last egg carefully in her basket. Sophie bounced on her toes as Ellie took the eggs back and handed her the basket to put inside. The little girl had blossomed over the past month, her shyness replaced with cheerful confidence. She helped with small tasks around the store and had appointed herself Clara's official protector and entertainer. "Daisy's waiting for us," Sophie announced importantly. "I think she likes me now." Daisy was the gentle brown cow Silas had purchased 2 weeks ago after their previous cow had gotten too old to produce much milk, so had been retired. Dora had always milked the cow, but getting down to the 3-legged stool was too hard for her now, so Ellie had volunteered to take over the job, and Sophie insisted on helping. In the small barn at the end of Silas's land, Daisy stood patiently chewing the last few tufts of hay in her rack. Ellie had learned to milk cows as a child when she'd spent summers with her aunt in the countryside, though it had taken a few days to remember the proper technique. "Can I try today?" Sophie asked eagerly. "Of course. Remember what I taught you." Ellie put Clara down on a pile of straw covered with a blanket, then perched on the stool with Sophie in front of her. Daisy had already been halter trained by the rancher who had bred her, and was docile enough not to be unsettled by the young girl's fumbled attempts. Grip her teats firmly so it doesn't tickle, then squeeze and pull, nice and rhythmically. Like this? Sophie concentrated intently, her tongue poking out slightly as she focused. 2 jets of milk flowed into the bucket. Perfect. You're getting very good at this. Sophie beamed with pride. These quiet moments together had become precious to Ellie. The little girl was hungry for attention and guidance, and Ellie found herself growing more attached to Sophie than she'd expected. As they worked, Sophie chattered about everything and nothing, her words flowing like a happy stream. Mrs. Lacey from the bakery said I'm getting taller. And Tommy Morris asked if Clara could be his sister too, but I told him she's already my sister, and one family is enough for a baby. Do you think Clara will like Christmas? I've never had a baby sister for Christmas before. I'm sure she'll love all the excitement, Ellie said, touched by how naturally Sophie included Clara in all her plans. They finished the milking and headed back inside where Dora was preparing breakfast. Perfect timing, she said as they entered the kitchen. Silas will be wanting his coffee before he opens the store. Ellie had learned to read the rhythm of life in the Reed household. Silas was always the first one awake, checking inventory and preparing for the day's business. He was unfailingly polite and considerate, but she sensed he was still cautious about letting anyone too close to his carefully ordered world. As if summoned by their conversation, Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. His dark blonde hair was slightly tousled from sleep, and he was already dressed for work in his simple shirt and suspenders. "Good morning," he said, his eyes crinkling at the edge as he smiled. Ellie felt her cheeks warm slightly under his gaze, as they had been doing more frequently lately. "Good morning, Pa," Sophie chirped. "I helped milk Daisy again, and she didn't kick even once." "That's because you're becoming quite the expert, thanks to Ellie's tuition," Silas said, settling into his chair as Ellie poured his coffee. "Thank you," he said quietly, their fingers brushing briefly as she handed him the cup. The simple contact sent an unexpected flutter through her heart, and she pulled her hand back quickly. After breakfast, Ellie made her way downstairs to help in the store, as had become her routine. She'd grown comfortable with the daily operations and had even begun to recognize the regular customers by name. Mrs. Hendy, who had recently opened a new boarding house, stopped in for her weekly supplies, chatting pleasantly about the approaching winter weather. "You're settling in well, Mrs. Warren," she observed. "Sophie seems much happier these days, and Silas, well, he's far chattier than he used to be. It must be nice for him to have someone his own age for company, rather than just Dora and his daughter." "Thank you," Ellie replied, though she wasn't sure how to respond to such personal observations. She'd noticed the change in Silas too, but she tried not to read too much into it. Throughout the morning, other townspeople stopped in, and Ellie found herself gradually being drawn into their conversations. One of the ranchers' wives asked about Clara's sleeping patterns. The blacksmith's wife inquired about her knitting skills. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, but Ellie remained careful to keep her answers vague when questions touched on her past. "Where did you say you were from originally?" Mrs. Hendy asked as Ellie measured out flour for her. "Back east," Ellie replied, her standard response. "It was time for a fresh start after my husband passed." "Of course, dear. It must have been so difficult, traveling all that way with a baby. You're very brave." Ellie nodded and quickly changed the subject, asking about Mrs. Hendy's grandchildren. She'd become skilled at deflecting questions without seeming rude, but each evasion made her feel guilty about deceiving these kind people. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, Ellie approached Silas with an idea she'd been considering. "I've been thinking about the arrangement of the shelves near the front window," she said hesitantly. "The light is so good there, but the current display doesn't really take advantage of it. Also, I thought if we change it each season, it will pique people's interest." Silas looked up from his ledger with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, if we moved the bobbins of lace and new tortoiseshell hair combs to catch the light, customers could see the true colors better. Also, I thought we could display the new handkerchiefs, candles, and wooden toys as well, as Christmas will soon be here. and perhaps the household items could go where the fabrics are now. They don't need as much space for folks to see them. Silas studied the area she'd indicated, considering her suggestion. That's very thoughtful. You're right about changing things up so it catches people's interest. Would you like to try rearranging things tomorrow when we're not so busy? If you wouldn't mind, Ellie said, pleased that he'd taken her idea seriously. Your suggestions are always welcome, Silas said. He ran a hand through his hair and gave her a rueful grin. I guess I've gotten a bit set in my ways. It's wonderful to have a second opinion and a different point of view. That evening, after the store was closed and Clara was settled for the night, Ellie and Sophie sat together in the sitting room with their knitting, while Silas continued with balancing the accounts downstairs. Ellie had been teaching Sophie the basic stitches, and the little girl was working diligently on her first real project. Remember, it's our secret, Sophie whispered conspiratorially as she concentrated on her uneven stitches. Of course, Ellie replied, equally quiet. Christmas presents should always be surprises. She had a feeling Silas suspected what they were making, but he had gallantly not mentioned it, to allow Sophie the thrill of surprising him. Sophie was knitting a muffler for her father, and shuffled with anticipation every time she worked on the slightly crooked rectangle that was slowly taking shape. Ellie admired Sophie's determination and quietly fixed the worst mistakes when the little girl wasn't looking. Do you think Pa will like it? Sophie asked, holding up her work to examine it critically. He'll love it because you made it yourself, Ellie assured her. That makes it more special than anything you could buy in a store. Will you help me wrap it when it's finished? I'd be honored to help. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the clicking of needles and the crackling of the fire. Clara dozed in her cradle nearby, and Dora dozed in her chair, her own knitting forgotten in her lap. Mrs. Warren? Sophie said softly. Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you came to live with us. I prayed for a long time for someone to help take care of Clara and me, and God sent you. Ellie's throat tightened with emotion. I'm glad I came too, Sophie. Do you think you'll stay forever? The innocent question hit Ellie harder than she'd expected. I hope so, she said honestly. Good, because I think Pa likes you a lot. He smiles more now, and he doesn't get that sad look in his eyes as much as he used to. Ellie felt a fresh pang of guilt gnaw at her conscience. These good people had welcomed her into their lives, trusting her completely. Sophie looked up to her, Dora relied on her, and Silas. Silas had begun to look at her with something warmer than mere gratitude. How could she continue to lie to them? Every day that passed made her deception feel heavier. They deserved to know the truth about who she really was and why she had come to Cottonwood Creek. But how could she tell them about Vincent's wrongdoings and Anton Colley's cruel threats, or about the danger that might still be following her? I think we should finish the row we're doing. Then it's time for you to go to bed, Sophie, Ellie said, forcing herself to focus on the present moment. Can I tell Clara a bedtime story if she's still awake? Sophie asked. Of course. What will it be about tonight? The princess who lived in the mountains and had a pet bear, Sophie said immediately. Ellie smiled. Sophie's stories were always elaborate adventures featuring brave princesses and talking animals that featured courage and happy endings. It was exactly what Ellie hoped for Clara's life, a happy ending. What if I'm expecting too much? What if Vincent's violent death and his bad deeds cast a shadow over Clara's life that she can never escape from? I should have left him when I first suspected he was up to no good. Her mind churned as she tentatively allowed herself to imagine a better future for herself. Could she truly be Ellie Warren, respected member of the Cottonwood Creek community, cherished housekeeper, and perhaps someday something more to Silas Reed, instead of a frightened woman running from enemies her husband had made? The November wind rattled the windows, and in the distance, she heard the sound of a stagecoach arriving. New people came to Cottonwood Creek every week, and each time Ellie wondered if her past might catch up with her. She pushed the worry aside as she tidied away her knitting. For now, this moment was enough. Her daughter was safe and loved, Sophie doted on her, and Dora felt like family. As for Silas, he made her feel things she'd never felt with Vincent. Safety, respect, and something else she was afraid to name. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this warm house with these good people, Ellie allowed herself to believe that perhaps she really had found a place where she and Clara could belong. She shivered again as she heard the stagecoach drivers shout, telling folks to disembark near the stop just along the street. The noise of voices and the commotion of passengers and luggage being unloaded was a normal sound in a frontier town, nothing to worry about. But as she walked to the window and peeked out into the dark street, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming to Cottonwood Creek. She could only hope that when it arrived, she would be strong enough to protect the new life she was building for herself and Clara. Chapter 5. The morning had started like any other. Ellie was restocking the shelves in Reed's general store, while Clara napped peacefully in her crib behind the counter. Sophie was at the small table in the corner, working diligently on her school reading and writing homework, her tongue poking out as she concentrated. "Mrs. Warren, could you help me find some thread?" Mrs. Hendy called from the far aisle. "I need something that will match this blue fabric." "Of course," Ellie replied, walking over with a selection of spools. She was explaining the different shades when the bell above the door chimed, announcing a new customer. Ellie glanced up automatically, as had become her habit, and felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach dropped, and the spools of thread fell from her hands and scattered across the floor. Standing in the doorway was a man she recognized all too well, though he looked different from how she remembered. He was thin and wiry, with slicked-back dark hair and cold, calculating eyes. His clothes were dusty from travel, and he carried a battered leather bag filled with various goods. But it was the scar on his left hand, clearly visible as he adjusted his grip on the bag, that confirmed her worst fears. Jonah Bell. She trembled as she realized without doubt that it was him, one of Vincent's associates from the docks at Baltimore, a cruel man who people spoke about in hushed tones. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Hendy asked with concern as Ellie stood frozen, staring at the newcomer who hadn't yet spotted her. "Yes," she croaked. Ellie forced herself to move, kneeling to collect the scattered thread while her mind raced. How had he found her? Had Anton Colley sent him? Were she and Clara in immediate danger? Jonah marched straight into the store and greeted Silas in friendly tones. "Good morning, sir. Jonah Bell's the name. I'm a traveling merchant, new to these parts. Heard you folks might be interested in some quality goods from back east." "Welcome to Cottonwood Creek," Silas replied courteously. "What kind of goods are you offering?" "Oh, a bit of everything. Pots, pans, household items, tools. I repair things too, whatever folks need." Jonah's eyes swept the store, taking in every detail, and Ellie shrank further behind the fabric display, praying he wouldn't notice her. But his gaze found her anyway, and she saw the flicker of recognition cross his features before he quickly looked away. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. "Mrs. Warren?" Mrs. Hendy was still looking at her with concern. "You've gone rather pale. Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm fine," Ellie managed, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Just a little dizzy. Perhaps I should sit down." Silas immediately looked over, his expression filling with concern. "Would you like me to help you upstairs?" No. I just need some fresh air. It's nothing to worry about. Just a bad night's sleep is all." Ellie walked unsteadily toward the door, desperate to get away from Jonah's presence. "Perhaps I could step outside for a moment?" "Of course. Sophie, would you watch Clara for a few minutes?" "No, I'll take her," Ellie said, sounding sharper than she intended. She rushed through the store and scooped Clara up into her arms, glad that she stayed fast asleep. Keeping her eyes averted, she hurried back past the displays, but as she passed Jonah, he spoke quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "Fancy meeting you here, Eleanor. You're looking well." "You're mistaken," she hissed. "That's not who I am." The use of her real name felt like a stab to the heart and sent a chill through her entire body. She didn't respond, didn't even look at him, but pushed through the door and out onto the wooden sidewalk. The brisk fall breeze felt cold against her flushed cheeks, but she welcomed it. She walked quickly to the end of the building, where she could lean against the wall and try to collect herself. Her hands were shaking, and she felt sick to her stomach as she gazed down at Clara's soft hair and how her lashes fanned on her cheeks. After all these weeks of peace and safety, her past had finally caught up with her. A few minutes later, Silas appeared around the corner, his face creased with worry. "Ellie, what's wrong? You looked terrified in there." She forced herself to meet his eyes, though every instinct told her to run. "That man, the traveling merchant, I have a bad feeling about him." "What kind of bad feeling?" Ellie struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal too much. "He reminds me of someone from my past, someone I'd rather not think about." Silas studied her face carefully. "Did he say something to upset you?" "Not exactly." She couldn't tell him about Jonah using her real name without explaining everything else. I don't trust him. There's something in his eyes that doesn't match his friendly words." "Would you like me to ask him to leave?" The kind-hearted offer touched her deeply, but she knew it would only make things worse. If Jonah had come looking for her, sending him away would confirm her presence in Cottonwood Creek. "No, that wouldn't be right. He hasn't done anything wrong. I'm probably just being foolish." She leaned her head against the wooden planks of the house and took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Could she pull off denying his accusations of who she was, brazenly say he was making a mistake? It had been a while since she'd seen Jonah and Vincent, on a dark night when she'd gone looking for Vincent in one of the rougher saloons to get the rent money off him to pay their landlord, and Jonah had been drunk. But still, she knew he wasn't a man to cross. "Your instincts aren't foolish," Silas said firmly. "If something about him makes you uncomfortable, I'll keep a close eye on him." "Thank you. I'm sure it's nothing." They returned to the store, where Jonas was examining some of their decorative leather items to adorn saddles with apparent interest. He looked up as they entered, his smile pleasant and unremarkable. "It really is a fine establishment you have here," he said to Silas. "I might be able to offer you some items that would complement your current stock. Perhaps we could discuss business over dinner? I hope your wife is feeling better now." "I appreciate the offer," Silas replied politely, "but we usually keep our evenings to ourselves. Family time, you understand. And Ellie is my housekeeper, not my wife, although also a very good friend." Jonas's gaze flicked briefly to Ellie. "Of course, my mistake, and family and friends are important. A man should cherish what he has. Fate has a nasty habit of taking what we most care for. At least, that's what I find to be true." The subtle threat in his words made Ellie's blood run cold, but she forced herself to remain calm. She put Clara back in her crib and busied herself with tidying the nearest shelf to her, trying to appear normal while staying as far from Jonah as possible. For the next half hour, Jonah browsed the store, occasionally chatting with customers. He presented himself as a harmless traveling merchant, but Ellie could feel his eyes on her whenever she moved. He was studying her, noting her routines and relationships. During a quiet moment, when Silas was helping another customer and Sophie was upstairs with Dora, Jonas seized his chance to approach the counter where Ellie was collecting items for Dr. Temple's regular grocery order. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his mask of friendliness vanishing with frightening speed. "I don't know what you want," Ellie whispered back, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I'm not who you think." "Don't give me that. I never forget a face, and calling yourself Ellie Warren won't throw me off the scent. Vincent had something that belonged to my boss, Anton Colley. Something valuable. He wants it back." He pulled his jacket back slightly to reveal a holstered pistol. "It's taken us a while to figure out you ran west, which was a big mistake. Mr. Colley's pretty mad about it, so the sooner you hand it over, the better." "I don't know anything about Vincent's business dealings. I told Anton Colley the same thing." Jonas's smile was cold and calculating. "Yes, Anton mentioned his conversation with you. Pity about your sudden departure from Baltimore. Left a lot of people wondering where you'd gone, including the nice folks at the orphanage who had a lovely family in mind for Clara." She edged closer to the crib, a mixture of fear and anger rising in her chest. "I came west for a fresh start, that's all. With a new name, Ellie Warren. Very clever, but not clever enough. The feeble man at the post office was very helpful, and it didn't take much to persuade the station master to sing like a canary about where you'd headed." Ellie's hands clenched into fists. "What do you want from me?" "What Vincent stole," Jonah said coldly, keeping his voice low. "It was a considerable sum of money that doesn't belong to you or your husband. Me Collie gave you a chance to do the right thing, but his patience isn't endless. I've told you, I don't have any money. If I did, would I be working as a housekeeper?" Jonas glanced around the store, taking in the modest but comfortable surroundings. "Seems like you've landed on your feet well enough. Nice family, respectable business. Be a shame if something happened to disrupt all this." Happiness. The threat was unmistakable. Ellie felt tears of fear and frustration prick her eyes. "Please, just leave us alone. I don't have what you're looking for. I packed a few clothes, and that's it." "We'll see about that," Jonas said, his voice returning to its normal volume as Silas finished with his customer and looked their way. "Thank you for the information about local suppliers, Mrs. Warren. Very helpful." He tipped his hat to Silas and made his way to the door. "I'll likely be in town for a few days, speaking to a few other business owners. I'm sure we'll see each other again soon." After he left, Silas came over to Ellie, who was gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles were white. "What did he want?" Silas asked. "He was just asking about local towns and such," Ellie managed, hating herself for the lie. Silas didn't look convinced. "Ellie, if that man is bothering you in any way, I want you to tell me. I won't stand for anyone making you uncomfortable in our home." The protectiveness in his voice nearly broke her resolve to handle this alone. "Thank you, but I'm sure it's nothing." But even as she said the words, she knew it wasn't nothing. Jonah Bell had tracked her down, and Anton Colley was still convinced she had Vincent's stolen money, which meant her new life in Cottonwood Creek was in danger. She would have to be more careful, and somehow find a way to convince him she truly didn't have whatever Vincent had stolen. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. Ellie went through the motions of her work, but her attention was divided between her tasks and watching for any sign of Jonah. She found herself startled at every unexpected sound. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Sophie chattered about her day, but Ellie barely heard her. Her mind was consumed with worry about what Jonas might do next. "Are you feeling unwell?" Dora asked. "Silas told me you had to go outside for some air earlier. I can do more chores if it's too much for you." "Just tired," Ellie replied, forcing herself to take a bite of the excellent stew. "Usually I sleep so well here, but I think it was doing the Christmas stocktake that got my mind whirling." Silas was watching her carefully, and she could see the questions in his eyes. He sensed something was wrong, but he was too polite to press the issue in front of the others. After dinner, as they were cleaning up, Silas spoke quietly to her. "I asked around about our visitor today. No one in town has heard of him before, and his story about being a traveling merchant doesn't quite add up. His clothes are too scruffy, and something just doesn't seem right about him. It's not unusual to get outlaws in these parts. Strange that he insisted he knew you from somewhere." Ellie's heart sank. Silas was more observant than she'd realized. "What do you think he really wants?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Sheriff Jarman is a good man, and he keeps a close eye on strangers who linger in town without clear business." The mention of the sheriff made Ellie nervous. What if he'd convinced the authorities that she was a criminal? "He said he would be gone in a few days. I guess my gown is a common style, and there were plenty of young ladies on the train who looked similar to me." She attempted a reassuring smile, but her words sounded hollow. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed and the household had grown quiet, Ellie tiptoed into the living room that overlooked the darkened street. Somewhere out there, Jonah Bell was planning his next move. She could feel it in her bones. A movement in the shadows across the street caught her attention. A figure stood beneath the overhang of a new dressmaker's store, partially hidden, but clearly watching their building. Even in the dim light, she could make out the familiar, thin silhouette. She clasped her hands together and stumbled back from the window as she realized Jonah was watching her, like a mountain lion waiting to pounce on its prey. Her heart hammered, and she felt sick. She had to make a plan. Running again wasn't an option. She had no money and nowhere to go. Besides, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving Silas, Sophie, and Dora, who had become her family. But staying in Cottonwood Creek meant putting them all in danger. Jonah wouldn't care about innocent people getting hurt if it served his purposes. As she crept back to bed, Ellie realized that her time of peace and safety in Cottonwood Creek was over. The past had caught up with her, and now she would have to face it one way or another. The only question was how much of the truth she would have to reveal to protect the people she'd come to love. Chapter 6. The sun was just rising over the mountains when Ellie slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Clara, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib. She'd spent the night tossing and turning, her mind racing with worry about Jonah Bell and what he might do next. Every creak of the building had made her heart pound. Every shadow outside her window had seemed like a threat. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and padded quietly through the living quarters to the kitchen. The house was still and silent, with Dora and Sophie fast asleep. But as she reached for the coffee pot, she heard the soft sound of boots on the stairs. Silas appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day, but there were tired lines around his hazel eyes. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked quietly. Ellie shook her head, grateful not to be alone with her fears. "I thought some coffee might help." "Good idea. Why don't we take it outside? The morning air might do us both some good." They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing the coffee and gathering cups. Silas led the way to the back veranda that overlooked his land behind the store. 2 simple wooden chairs sat there, where he sometimes came to think in the evenings after the store closed. The last few stars were fading, with the first light of dawn painting the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold, which lifted her spirits. Ellie pulled her shawl closer and settled into one of the chairs, accepting the steaming cup Silas offered her. "It's so beautiful here," she murmured. "I don't think I would ever tire of this view. It reminds me that the Lord's work is in everything, great and small." "I know what you mean," Silas sighed. "I forgot to notice the good things in life for a little while after losing Marianne, and I worried about whether I could give Sophie what she needed. Ironically, it was Sophie's happiness in the simplest of things that helped me through those dark days. That and a nudge from a good friend and Dora to place the advertisement," he added with a chuckle. For a few minutes, they sat in peaceful quiet, watching the town slowly wake up. A dog barked in the distance, and smoke began to rise from chimneys as other early risers started their day. "Ellie," Silas said finally, his voice gentle but determined, "I think it's time you told me what's really going on." She took a sip of her coffee, buying herself a moment to think. The hot liquid warmed her, but it couldn't chase away the chill of fear that had settled in her bones. "I saw you at your window last night," he continued. "I heard a noise and slipped out to check the barn was locked, then had a look round the front of the store as well. You were watching the street like you expected trouble. And yesterday, when that man came into the store, I've never seen you look so frightened." Ellie's hands tightened around her cup. She had come to the conclusion in the middle of the night that this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped for more time to figure out how to explain everything without revealing the full truth. "You're right," she admitted finally. "There are things I haven't told you, things about my past that I was hoping to leave behind." Silas leaned forward slightly, with a nod of encouragement. "I'm listening, and I won't judge. I hope you know that." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. It was all very well for Silas to say he wouldn't judge her, but she couldn't bear to see disappointment in his eyes either. "My husband, Vincent, he wasn't the man I thought I was marrying. When we were first wed, I believed he worked honestly at the docks in Baltimore, loading and unloading ships. But gradually I began to realize that his real work was different." "Different how?" "He was involved with dangerous men who used threats and violence to get what they wanted from the business owners around the docks. I guess you could call it a protection racket." The words felt heavy as she spoke them, like stones she'd been carrying in her heart. "I didn't want to see it at first. I made excuses for the late nights and secrecy, the way he sometimes came home with bruises or torn clothes. I told myself I was imagining it when I saw folks cross the street to avoid him." Silas's expression darkened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. The night I found out for certain, I went looking for him at one of the taverns where he sometimes drank. I needed rent money, and our landlord was threatening to throw us out. Ellie's voice grew smaller as she remembered that terrible evening. I saw him there with other men, and I heard them talking about a merchant who refused to pay them protection money. They were planning to hurt him, to make an example. What did you do? I ran home and pretended I hadn't seen or heard anything, but Vincent knew. He could always tell when I was upset. He told me it was business, nothing for me to worry about. He said the less I knew, the safer Clara and I would be. What about you? Silas's hands tightened around his mug of coffee, and a muscle clenched in his jaw. In my experience, men like him rarely keep the violence strictly at work. Did he hurt you? She nodded once, not able to meet his eyes. If she thought about it, she could still feel the sting of the back of Vincent's hand across her cheek. I feel bad that I didn't grieve for Vincent when he was killed in a robbery at the docks, according to the officer of the law who told me. I just felt relieved that he would never turn his anger on Clara one day. Silas was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. And the man who came to the store yesterday? Ellie's throat tightened. Jonah Bell. He was one of Vincent's associates. After Vincent died, his boss, Anton Cawley, came to see me. He accused Vincent of stealing money from them, and he wanted me to return it. Did Vincent steal from them? I don't know, Ellie said, hoping he would believe her. Cawley seemed to think so, but Vincent never told me anything about his business. If he took money, I never saw it. We lived in a couple of rooms in a dingy tenement and barely had enough for food and rent. He liked to play cards and spend time at the saloon. So you left Baltimore because of these threats? Ellie nodded, tears pricking her eyes. Cawley gave me 3 days to produce the money, or he said Clara might end up in an orphanage. I was terrified. I had no family, no friends I could turn to. That's when I found your advertisement. Understanding dawned in Silas's eyes. You came here seeking safety, not just employment. I came here seeking both, Ellie said, meeting his gaze. I needed a place where Clara could grow up without fear, where I could work and support her. I never meant to bring danger to your door. Silas reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady, an anchor in the storm of her fear. You're not bringing danger to my door, Ellie. You're part of this family now, and families protect each other. The kindness in his voice made her throat constrict with emotion. But you don't understand. Jonah found me somehow. He tracked me across the country, and he's not going to give up easily. These men don't care about innocent people getting hurt. Then we'll have to make sure they don't hurt anyone, Silas said firmly. Sheriff Jarman is a good man, and he won't stand for threats against the people in his town. Ellie shook her head. I can't go to the sheriff. What if Jonah has convinced them that I'm a criminal? What if they believe his story over mine? What story could he possibly tell that would make anyone believe you're dangerous? Silas shook his head with a warm smile. You're a devoted mother who works hard and treats everyone with kindness. Anyone with eyes can see what kind of person you are. All my customers have said how polite and courteous you are to them. But I lied about who I am, Ellie said, the guilt she'd been carrying finally spilling out. I gave you a false name, created a false story about my past. How can you trust anything I say now that you know I'm a liar? That makes me almost no better than Vincent. No, you're nothing like him. Silas was quiet for a moment, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. What's your real name? Ellie Durant. I took my mother's maiden name, Warren, and shortened Eleanor to Ellie. Eleanor, he said softly, as if testing how it sounded. It's a beautiful name. I hated deceiving you, she continued, the words rushing out now. Every day I spent here, every kindness you showed me, made the lies feel heavier. But I was so afraid of losing this place and having to leave Sophie and Dora. This is the first time since my parents died that I've felt truly safe and cared for. You're one of us, Silas said without hesitation, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Sophie adores you. Dora thinks of you as a daughter, and He paused, as if weighing his words carefully. I care about you more than I probably should, given that you're my employee. Ellie's heart skipped a beat at his words, but the moment was overshadowed by her continued fear. Even knowing what I've told you? Even knowing that I've brought this trouble to your family? Especially knowing it, Silas said. You've shown incredible courage, Ellie. You faced an impossible situation and made the best choice you could for your daughter. That's nothing to be ashamed of. I still feel like I'm not telling you everything, Ellie admitted, wrestling with her guilt. There are things about Vincent's business, about the money they think he stole. I don't know the whole truth myself. Then we'll figure it out together, Silas said. But first, I think we need to talk to Sheriff Jarman. Before Ellie could protest, they heard the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk out front. Silas released her hand and stood, moving to where he could see around the corner of the building. It's Sheriff Jarman, he said quietly. He's talking to someone on the street. Ellie's blood ran cold. Is it Jonah? Silas peered around the corner more carefully. Yes, the sheriff seems to be asking him questions about how long he's staying in town. They could hear the murmur of voices, but couldn't make out the words. After several minutes, the conversation ended, and they heard footsteps moving away in opposite directions. Silas returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. Jarman is already suspicious of him. That's good news. What if Jonah convinces him that I'm the criminal? I suspect that Anton Cawley must have been bribing a few officers in Baltimore for them to look the other way so they could continue with their criminal activities. What's to say he's not doing the same here? Ellie asked, her old fears resurfacing. Then we'll tell the sheriff the truth, just like you told me, Silas said. Jarman is a fair man. He'll listen to all sides before making any judgments. As the sun climbed higher, they could hear the sounds of the household beginning to stir inside. Dora would be up soon, followed by Sophie, and the normal rhythm of their day would begin. But everything felt different now, shadowed by the threat that Jonah represented. What happens now? Ellie asked. Now we go about our normal business, but we stay alert, Silas said. And tonight, I'll have a talk with Sheriff Jarman. Not about you, he added quickly, seeing her expression. About Jonah Bell and why he's really in Cottonwood Creek. What if he finds out about my real identity? What if word spreads around town? Silas stood and helped her to her feet. Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But I have faith in the people of this town, Ellie. They've gotten to know you over these past weeks. They've seen how you care for Clara, how you help Sophie, how hard you work. That matters more than whatever name you go by. As they prepared to go back inside, she felt some of the weight she'd been carrying begin to lift. She'd told Silas the truth, or at least most of it, and he hadn't turned her away. He'd listened with compassion and offered his protection and support. But even as relief washed over her, she knew this was only the beginning. Jonah Bell wasn't going to give up easily, and she had a horrible feeling that he would stop at nothing. The only thing she hadn't told Silas was that Vincent had circled his advertisement in particular. Was it a coincidence? Or had Vincent planned on hiding in Cottonwood Creek himself, under the guise of her working for Silas? She would never know. For now, though, she had an ally, someone who cared about her and Clara, someone willing to stand between them and the dangers of her past. As they walked back into the warmth of the house, Ellie allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this crisis together. The sound of Sophie's cheerful voice calling for breakfast reminded her that there were innocent people depending on her to keep them safe. Whatever came next, she would have to be strong for all of them. But at least now, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Chapter 7. Silas had never known it so hard to concentrate on his customers and work in the store that morning. After his earlier conversation with Ellie on the veranda, his mind kept circling back to the same troubling questions. Something about Jonah Bell's story didn't sit right with him, and something about Vincent Durant's supposed death felt wrong too. He kept coming back to two troubling questions, which didn't seem to have occurred to Ellie yet, so he was loath to share them with her. If Vincent had been involved with corrupt police officers, as Ellie suspected, what if those same officers had helped him fake his death to get away from Anton Cawley? He could easily have slipped the officers a few coins to fabricate his story, because it sounded like a very tangled web of lies that he'd gotten involved with. And Ellie had mentioned Vincent's burial had been an unmarked pauper's grave because she didn't have the money for anything more. Which led to another, more troubling question. What if Vincent Durant was still alive somewhere and had discovered where his wife had fled? The thoughts gnawed at Silas as he went through the motions of serving customers and managing the store. Ellie was quieter than usual, clearly still mulling over their morning conversation and worried about Jonah's continued presence in town. She kept Clara close, rarely letting the baby out of her sight, and jumped at every unexpected sound. He had to acknowledge to himself that he was developing feelings for Ellie, which he had never expected to experience again after Marianne's passing. He hadn't held out much hope when he placed his advertisement, but each day he knew he was becoming more and more drawn to this enigmatic woman who had arrived off the train like a blessing in disguise to heal his weary heart. By mid-afternoon, Silas couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. "Ellie," he murmured during a quiet moment between customers, "I need to step out for a bit. Can you manage the store? Dora is just upstairs if you need her, and I won't be long. If Jonah comes back, don't hesitate to go next door and ask Mr. Carruthers for help. He keeps a rifle under his counter, and he'll defend you, no questions asked." She paled slightly, and he wondered if he'd said too much. But then she smiled and nodded. "I trust whatever you've arranged, Silas. Where are you going?" "Just to take care of some business. I shouldn't be long." He didn't want to explain his theory about Vincent until he had more information. It might be completely wrong, and there was no point in worrying her unnecessarily. He tipped his hat in greeting to a few folks as he hurried along the street, but his briskness meant that nobody stopped to chat, which was just as he wanted. He didn't think Jonah would go to the store again, but he didn't want to leave the people he cared most for in the world for a minute longer than necessary. The post office was a single-story building in the center of town, run by Harold Ketchen, a meticulous man in his 60s who had taken up the position the previous year. Harold prided himself on knowing every piece of mail that came through Cottonwood Creek, and he had an excellent memory for details. "Good afternoon, Silas," Harold said, looking up from sorting a stack of letters. "What brings you here on this fine fall day? Are you expecting a delivery of something new for the store? Some small items that didn't require transit on the steam train, perhaps?" Mrs. Ketchen was delighted with the new hairbrush your new assistant sold her. "Ellie, is it?" His eyes twinkled, and Silas knew that Harold's wife was probably hoping to see the two of them married, as she loved nothing more than a romantic happy ever after. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about unclaimed mail," Silas said, trying to sound casual. "Do you ever get letters addressed to folks who don't live here?" Harold nodded. If he thought Silas's question odd, he was too polite to say so. "More often than you might think. Folks move around a lot out here, and sometimes letters follow old addresses or get misdirected. And don't even get me started on keeping up with all the letters from mail-order brides. I keep unclaimed mail for a few months before returning it to the sender if they leave a return address." "Uh-huh." Silas glanced over his shoulder. "I'm looking for something specific. A letter that might have been addressed to Ellie Durant. It would have arrived sometime in the past couple of months." Harold's eyebrows rose with interest. "Ellie Durant? That's an unusual request. May I ask why you're looking for it?" Silas had prepared for this question. "I have reason to believe the person it was meant for is living in Cottonwood Creek under a different name. If there's a letter waiting for her, I'd like to make sure she receives it. Well, as it happens," Harold moved to a wooden box behind the counter and began rifling through its contents. "I might have something for you. Found it quite curious at the time." He pulled out a torn envelope, clearly damaged and already opened. "This arrived about 5 weeks ago, addressed to an Ellie Durant. That's all it says. There's no address, which is unusual. The envelope was already torn when it arrived. Maybe it got damaged in the mailbags on the train. Some of the porters can be mighty rough with them. It's a miracle more letters aren't damaged, but it's not my place to say so." Silas's pulse quickened. "Did it have a letter inside?" "It did, but it was in even worse condition. I almost threw it away, but my dear wife said I should keep it just in case someone came looking for it." Harold reached back into the box and produced several pieces of paper, some with torn edges. The envelope had a Baltimore postmark, if that means anything to you. Silas stared at the papers in Harold's hands, his mind racing. A letter from Baltimore, sent to Ellie Durant a few weeks ago. That would have been right around the time Vincent supposedly died. "May I see it?" Silas asked. Harold hesitated. "Well, strictly speaking, I'm not allowed to give it to just anyone, as it's not addressed to you. But if you really think you know who it belongs to?" His question hung in the air. "I do, and I'll make sure she gets it." He gave the postmaster an earnest look. "You trust me, don't you, Harold? I promise I'll explain as soon as I can, but it's important. I guess. You were very good when we needed help with repairing our roof after the storm last winter." Harold handed over the torn pieces reluctantly. "It's not much to look at, I'm afraid. Most of it's illegible." Silas carefully examined the fragments, laying them out on the counter a little way from Harold. The paper was of poor quality, and much of the ink had smeared or faded. But he could make out enough words to send chills down his spine. The handwriting was masculine, and at the top of one fragment, he could clearly read, "Dear Eleanor." His heart pounded as he tried to piece together more of the message. Most of it was too damaged to read, but scattered phrases jumped out at him. "Hope you found the advertisement to head west. Gave something valuable to the person I trust most for safekeeping. If anything happens to me, you'll know where to look. Not sure if going against Anton will end well for me. His men are suspicious." The signature at the bottom was partially torn, but Silas could make out Vin at the ragged edge, then nothing more. It sure looked like Vincent Durant had written this letter to his wife, knowing that it was likely he might not live much longer. Either that, or he had faked his death and might suddenly reappear to claim her and the money back again. Silas's mind raced through the possibilities. If Vincent had faked his death and later discovered where Ellie had gone, he might have written to her, planning to follow. But the tone of the letter seemed urgent, almost desperate, and the reference to Anton's men getting suspicious suggested Vincent knew he was in danger when he wrote it. He couldn't help but wonder about the sort of man Vincent was. Clearly, he'd had few morals, making a living by threatening others as part of the protection racket at the docks, then stealing from the other crooks. It reminded him there was no honor among thieves. "I need to get this to its rightful owner," Silas said, carefully placing the letter fragments in the tattered envelope and then putting it in his pocket. "Of course, I hope it brings some comfort to whoever was waiting for it." Silas hurried back to the store, and his heart lifted when he saw Ellie behind the counter, bouncing Clara gently in her arms while Sophie played quietly nearby with her knitting. The scene looked peaceful, but he could see the tension in Ellie's shoulders and the way her eyes darted to the windows. "Ellie," he said quietly, "I need to show you something." She looked up at him, immediately sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" "Sophie, would you mind watching the store for a few minutes? We'll just be out back in the storeroom." Sophie nodded eagerly, setting aside her knitting project, and Silas led Ellie to the back room, where they could speak privately. "I hope you don't mind, but I went to the post office," he began, pulling out the letter fragments. "I had a theory about Vincent, about whether he might still have been alive after his supposed death." Ellie's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "This letter was addressed to Ellie Durant. It arrived here 2 weeks ago with a Baltimore postmark from 3 weeks ago. That's more than 2 weeks after you left Baltimore." Ellie stared at the torn papers in shock. "That's impossible. The police said Vincent was killed in a robbery." "Read it," Silas said gently, handing her the fragments. Ellie's hands shook as she tried to piece together the torn letter. He watched her face as she read the scattered phrases, saw the moment when the full implication hit her. "He was alive," she whispered. "Vincent was alive when I got here, and he knew where I was." "It appears so. But Ellie, look at this part about giving something valuable to someone he trusted." She found the relevant fragment and read it again. "I don't understand. Vincent never gave me anything valuable. We barely had enough money for food and rent. Maybe he didn't give it to you directly. Maybe he gave it to someone else, someone he trusted to keep it safe. Ellie shook her head in confusion. But who? Vincent didn't trust anyone. He was always suspicious of neighbors, acquaintances, even people he worked with. Think, Ellie. There must have been someone. The letter says, the person I trust most. Who would that be? Before Ellie could answer, they heard the bell above the store's front door chime. Voices drifted back to them, one of them unmistakably belonging to Jonah Bell. Where is everyone? Jonah's voice carried a hint of impatience. I was hoping to speak with your father about some business. Silas and Ellie exchanged alarmed glances. They could hear Sophie's young voice responding politely, but she sounded nervous. Pa will be right out, Mr. Bell. He's just in the back room with Mrs. Warren. Uh-huh, the woman who thinks she can deceive me, Jonah growled, and something in his tone made Silas's blood run cold. Stay here, Silas whispered to Ellie, but she shook her head. I can't hide forever, and I won't let Sophie deal with him alone. They emerged from the back room together, Ellie still holding Clara protectively. Jonah stood near the counter, examining some leather goods with apparent interest. But Silas noticed how his eyes immediately fixed on Ellie when she appeared. Mr. Bell, Silas said evenly. What can I do for you? I was hoping we could discuss that business arrangement I mentioned, Jonah said, his smile not reaching his eyes. I have some items that might interest your customers. As I told you before, I'm satisfied with my current suppliers. Jonah's gaze shifted to Ellie, and he gave her a thin smile. And how are you feeling today, Mrs. Warren? You looked quite unwell yesterday. I'm fine, thank you, Ellie replied, but Silas could hear the strain in her voice. That's good to hear. I'd hate for anything to happen to such a lovely family. Jonah's eyes lingered on Clara, and the threat was unmistakable. Children can be so vulnerable, can't they? It would be terrible if something were to happen to this sweet little one. The barely veiled menace in his words made Silas step protectively closer to Ellie. I think you should leave. Or perhaps I should get Sheriff Jarman to have a word with you about how you keep harassing an innocent woman. No need for that, although I don't know what you mean by your last comment. I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome. Jonah tipped his hat mockingly. But I'll be around town for a few more days. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to chat. He headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Mrs. Warren? I hope you find what you're looking for. Sometimes the things we're searching for are closer than we think. After he left, the store felt oppressively quiet. Sophie looked confused and frightened by the strange conversation she'd witnessed. Pa, what did he mean about finding something? She asked. Nothing important, sweetheart, Silas said, though his mind was racing. Jonah's parting words had been too specific, too pointed. He knew something about Vincent's letter, about whatever Vincent had hidden. Sophie, Ellie said, her voice carefully controlled, would you like to take Clara upstairs to Dora? I think she's ready for her nap. Sophie nodded and carefully took the baby, making her giggle by bouncing her up and down on her hip and showing her the colored cotton bobbins on the counter. Once they were alone, Ellie turned to Silas with fear in her eyes. He knows about the letter, doesn't he? He knows Vincent left something with someone. It certainly seems that way. The question is, who did Vincent trust enough to leave something valuable with? Ellie was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then her expression changed, and she looked up at Silas with sudden realization. There's only one person it can be. Before she could explain, they heard a scream from the store. Stop! Give her back! Pa! Mrs. Warren! That man came back and took Clara. Silas and Ellie rushed from the storeroom, but even as they ran, Silas knew with sickening certainty what they would find. Jonah Bell had made his move, and now Clara was in the hands of a desperate, dangerous man. Vincent's hidden treasure, whatever it was, had just become the ransom for an innocent child's life. Chapter 8. The world collapsed around Ellie the moment she heard Sophie's scream. Every breath felt like she was drowning. Every heartbeat echoed in her ears like thunder. Clara was gone. Her baby, her precious daughter, had been snatched away by that monster Jonah Bell. No, 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 she whispered, rushing to the front of the store where Sophie stood trembling, looking out onto the street, with tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Mrs. Warren. I tried to stop him, but he was too strong. He said Clara was just going for a little ride and would be back soon. but I knew he was lying. Sophie's words tumbled out between sobs. He had a horse waiting right outside. Ellie's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in front of Sophie, gently holding the little girl's shoulders. "Tell me exactly what happened, sweetheart. Every detail you can remember." "I was showing Clara the pretty bobbins, making her laugh, when that man came back through the door. He said he'd forgotten something, but then he just grabbed Clara right out of my arms. I screamed and tried to hold on to her, but he pushed me down and ran outside." "I didn't hear the bell on the door," Silas groaned. "He must have left the door ajar when he left before, planning to sneak back in again." The image of Clara being torn from Sophie's arms made Ellie sick to her stomach. Her baby must be so frightened, crying for her mama, and Ellie wasn't there to comfort her. "Which direction did he go, sweetheart?" Silas asked, his voice tight with worry. "Toward the hills," Sophie said, pointing west. "He had a dark horse, and Clara was very good. She only started crying when he rode away with her." Ellie couldn't breathe. She stood on shaking legs, her mind reeling with terror. "I have to go after them. I have to get Clara back." She looked up into Silas's expressive eyes for comfort. "Please, don't let the worst thing happen." "We'll get her back," Silas said firmly, placing his arm around her shoulders. "But we need help. I'm going to fetch Sheriff Jarman right now. Remember, Jonah's a stranger in these parts. He doesn't know the hills and mountains like we do." "There's no time," Ellie cried. "Every minute we waste, he's getting further away with my darling Clara. I wish Vincent had never crossed those horrible people. What was he thinking?" "Ellie, listen to me." Silas turned her to face him, his hazel eyes intense and determined. "Jonah Bell is a dangerous man. If we go charging after him unprepared, we could make things worse for Clara. The sheriff knows these hills better than anyone, and will need supplies and horses. He'll be able to get a posse together so more of us can track him down." Ellie knew he was right, but every instinct screamed at her to run into the wilderness, calling Clara's name. "What if he hurts her? What if—" "He won't," Silas said with conviction. "Clara is his bargaining chip. He needs her safe to get what he wants." Dora came hobbling down the stairs, having heard the commotion after waking from a nap in front of the fire. When she saw Sophie's tear-stained face and Ellie's devastated expression, she immediately understood something terrible had happened. "What's wrong? Where's Clara?" "Someone took her," Sophie said in a small voice. "That horrid man with the mean eyes." Dora's face went pale, and she immediately wrapped Sophie in her arms. "Dear Lord in heaven." "Stay here with Sophie and Ellie," Silas instructed Dora. "Keep the store locked and don't let anyone in except me or the sheriff. I'll be back with help." He squeezed Ellie's hands. "I promise you, we will bring Clara home safe." Silas grabbed his gun from the storeroom out the back, then strode away. I knew Jonah would do something like this. Ellie found herself pacing frantically while Dora tried to comfort Sophie. The minutes felt like hours as they waited, and she gritted her teeth as horrifying possibilities slid through her mind, like snakes lurking in the grass. What if Jonah decided Clara was too much trouble? What if he hurt her to punish them all for not having whatever Vincent had hidden? Jonah's actions had struck her in the heart like a dagger, and she knew he didn't have a scrap of empathy. When Silas finally returned with Sheriff Jarman and 3 other men, who she vaguely recognized from around the town, Ellie nearly collapsed with relief. Sheriff Jarman was a stocky man with kind but determined eyes, and he immediately took charge of the situation. "Mrs. Warren, I need you to tell me everything you know about this man and why he might have taken your daughter," the sheriff said. Ellie quickly explained about Vincent's criminal associates, about Jonah being sent by Anton Cawley to find stolen money, and about the letter that suggested Vincent had hidden something valuable with someone he trusted. "And you have no idea what Vincent might have hidden or with whom?" Sheriff Jarman asked. "None," Ellie said, though even as she spoke, a nagging thought tugged at the back of her mind. There was something she was missing, something important. "Well, we can't wait to figure that out now," the sheriff decided. "Jake, you and Tom take the North Trail. Bill, you come with me and Mr. Reed." "Mrs. Warren." "I'm coming with you," Ellie said firmly. "Ma'am, this could be dangerous." "That's my baby out there," Ellie interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm not staying behind." Silas stepped forward. She's right, Sheriff, and she might be the only person who can reason with Jonah if we find him. Sheriff Jarman looked like he wanted to argue, but the determination in Ellie's voice must have convinced him. Okay, but you stay behind us at all times, and you do exactly what we say. They gathered supplies quickly: ropes, weapons, water, and blankets. Someone brought Ellie a horse, and though she wasn't confident on horseback, desperation gave her courage. Clara needed her, and she would ride to wherever she had to get her baby back. Good luck, my dear, Dora said, holding her hands briefly. I'm praying the Lord will be on our side. The posse rode hard toward the hills, following the tracks Jonah's horse had left in the muddy ground. For the first hour, the trail was clear, but as they climbed higher into the rocky terrain, the tracks became harder to follow. He's trying to confuse us, Sheriff Jarman observed, studying the ground. These tracks double back on themselves, like he's trying to hide his real direction. They followed several false trails that led nowhere, wasting precious time. Ellie's anxiety grew with each passing minute. Somewhere out there, Clara was with a dangerous man who cared nothing for an innocent baby's welfare. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves in a maze of canyons and rocky outcroppings. The tracks seemed to lead in all directions, and Ellie could see the frustration growing on the men's faces. He knows these hills, Bill muttered. Either that, or he's just lucky. No, Ellie said quietly, studying the landscape around them. Something about the terrain looked familiar, though she couldn't place why. He's not just wandering, he's heading somewhere specific. What makes you say that? Silas asked. I don't know. It's just a feeling. Ellie closed her eyes, trying to think. Where had she seen a landscape like this before? Then it hit her. The logging camp. When we were on the train coming west, I remember seeing an old logging camp from the window. It was up in the hills, abandoned but still with some buildings standing. If Jonah wanted somewhere isolated to hide, Sheriff Jarman nodded grimly. I know the place. It's been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the timber company moved its operations further north. Good thinking, Mrs. Warren. They changed direction, and the men in the posse pointed out signs that they were on the right track in low voices. There were broken branches where someone had pushed through the undergrowth, fresh horse muck, and most telling of all, a small piece of Clara's blanket snagged on a bush, which Ellie recognized instantly. She's here, Ellie whispered, her heart pounding. Clara's here. The logging camp came into view as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows, and the fact that it was abandoned gave the place a desolate air that made her shiver. Several dilapidated buildings clustered around a clearing, with an old mill wheel and abandoned equipment scattered about. A faint thread of smoke rose from the chimney of one of the smaller buildings. There, Sheriff Jarman pointed. He's in the main cabin. They dismounted and approached carefully on foot, using the other buildings for cover. As they got closer, they could hear voices. Ellie's heart nearly stopped when she heard Clara crying. I'm coming, sweetheart, she whispered, and had to fight every instinct not to run toward the sound. Silas put a restraining hand on her arm. Wait, we need to be smart about this. Through a gap in the cabin's wooden planks, they could see Jonah sitting at a rough table, Clara in his arms. The baby was crying, and Jonah looked frustrated and angry. Be quiet and let me think, they heard him mutter. Your mama's going to come for you, and when she does, she's going to tell me where Vincent hid that money. Ellie couldn't stand it anymore. Before anyone could stop her, she stepped out from behind the building and marched toward the cabin. Let her go, Jonah, she called out. You want to talk to me? Here I am. Ellie, no, Silas shouted, but it was too late. The cabin door flew open, and Jonah appeared with Clara in one arm and a gun in the other. Clara was red-faced from crying, reaching desperately toward Ellie. Well, Jonah said with a cold smile. The devoted mama comes to rescue her cub. How touching. Did you bring that sniveling store owner with you? He glared around the clearing and grunted as he was met with nothing more than dense shadows under the trees. I came alone. Your tracks made it easy enough. Please, Ellie begged, stepping closer despite the gun pointed at her. She's just a baby. She hasn't done anything wrong. Neither have I, Jonah snapped. I'm just trying to collect what's rightfully owed to my boss. Give me what Vincent stole, and you can have your baby back. I've had enough of this godforsaken town anyway. Never thought I'd miss the city so much. I've told you, I don't have any money. Vincent never gave me anything. Then you better figure out where he hid it, because I'm not leaving Montana empty-handed. Behind Jonah, Ellie caught a glimpse of movement. Silas and the sheriff were positioning themselves around the cabin, but she needed to keep Jonah's attention focused on her. "What if I can't find it?" she asked, taking another small step forward. "What if Vincent didn't actually steal anything, or what if he spent it all before he died? Then I guess your baby will be raised in an orphanage after all," Jonah sneered, "because Anton Colley doesn't accept failure. Either that, or I'll kill you both. Nobody will ever find your bodies out here, not with the snow coming soon." "You're not going to hurt Clara," Ellie said with sudden conviction, "because you need her alive to control me. And you're not going to hurt me, because then you'll never get your money." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "Don't test me, Eleanor. I've killed people for less than what Vincent cost us." He flicked his gun up and let off a shot, sending birds flapping into the sky in fright. "My name is Ellie Warren," she said firmly, undeterred by his posturing, even though her heart was thudding with fear. Ellie Durant was left far behind in Baltimore. At that moment, Sheriff Jarman slunk out from the side of the cabin, his gun trained on Jonah. "Drop your weapon and put the baby down. Now!" Jonah spun toward the new threat, and in that split second of distraction, Ellie lunged forward. "Give me my daughter." Chaos erupted. Jonah cursed and tried to retreat back into the cabin while maintaining his grip on Clara. Ellie grabbed for the baby, and suddenly Silas was there, sprinting across the clearing and tackling Jonah to the ground. "Clara, my darling, you're safe now." Ellie caught her daughter as Jonah fell, immediately wrapping the crying baby in her arms and stumbling back a few steps away from the struggle. The other men rushed in, and within moments, Jonah was subdued and in handcuffs. He glared at Ellie with pure hatred as they hauled him to his feet. "This isn't over," he spat. "Anton will send someone else. He'll never stop looking for that money." "Let him look," Ellie said, holding Clara tightly against her chest. "He won't find us." "Anyone who comes to Cottonwood Creek will have to deal with me," Sheriff Jarman growled. "You'll be thrown in prison for a very long time, Mr. Bell, and I'll be contacting the officers in Baltimore about your associates. Of that, you can be very sure." He threw Jonah over the spare horse they'd brought and mounted his own. Now that the immediate danger was over, Ellie's legs trembled and she sank heavily on the cabin steps. Clara had stopped crying and was now contentedly chewing on her fist, apparently none the worse for her ordeal. But tears pricked the back of her eyes at how close it had come to ending very differently. Silas sat down beside them, his arm coming around Ellie's shoulders. "Are you okay?" he asked tenderly. "I am now," she whispered, "when I thought I might lose her." "You didn't, though." He gave her a kind smile. "And you never will. Clara is safe, and Jonah Bell is going to jail for a very long time. Thank you, Lord, for your generous blessings." She said the prayer silently in her head. "But what about Anton Colley? What if he really does send someone else? Then we'll deal with that when it happens." A muscle clenched in his jaw, and he scanned the shadows, tightening his arms slightly as though to protect her. "But for now, you're both safe. That's all that matters. Let's go home, Ellie." I like the sound of that, and poor Sophie, I must tell her again that this was not her fault, bless her. As they rode back toward Cottonwood Creek under the emerging twinkle of the nighttime stars, Ellie held Clara close and marveled at how much her life had changed. A few hours ago, she had been terrified of losing everything. Now, surrounded by people who had risked their lives to help her, she realized she had found something she had never expected to have, a family willing to fight for her. But was her nightmare really over? She groaned inwardly again at how Vincent had so carelessly put his wife and daughter in so much danger. He should have known better if he'd really cared for them. This is what true love feels like. The thought caught her unawares, and she glanced across at Silas's rugged silhouette with a growing certainty that she hoped they would marry one day. Her only fear was that Anton Colley might still find a way to snatch her newfound happiness away again. Chapter 9. The next morning, Ellie stood outside Sheriff Jarman's office with Silas, Clara sleeping peacefully in her arms. Despite the ordeal of the previous day, the baby seemed none the worse for her frightening experience, though Ellie doubted she would ever forget the terror of those hours when Clara had been missing. "Are you sure you want to hear this?" Silas asked quietly, his hand resting protectively on her lower back. "Sheriff Jarman said he doesn't mind you listening if it helps shed more light on things, but it might be hard for you. We thought it would be best to stay outside, so you don't have to face him again." "I need to know," Ellie replied, adjusting Clara's shawl against the cool morning air. There had been a sprinkling of snow overnight, dusting the town in white, and their breath formed clouds over their heads. "If there are others coming after us, I need to understand what we're facing." Through the window, they could see Sheriff Jarman sitting across from Jonah Bell in the jailhouse office. Jonah looked disheveled and angry, his usually slicked-back hair hanging in his face and his clothes wrinkled from a night in the cells out back. "I've told you everything," they heard Jonah say, his voice carrying through the open window. "I was hired to find Ellie Durant and recover what her husband stole. That's all I know." "Who hired you?" Sheriff Jarman pressed. "Give me names." "Anton Cawley," Jonah replied after a moment's hesitation. "He runs operations down at the Baltimore docks, keeping the warehouse owners in line, if you get what I'm saying." "A protection racket, huh?" The sheriff rubbed his jaw, looking thoughtful. "How many are involved?" Jonah was quiet for a long moment, and Ellie could see him weighing his options. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't know. There could be people above Anton, but he doesn't tell me that sort of thing. That's not how it works. You get told what you need to know, nothing more." Sheriff Jarman leaned forward. "What exactly did Vincent Durant steal?" "Money. A lot of it. From several businesses that were under our protection. All the money is supposed to be given to Anton, and he pays us out of it." Jonah's voice grew bitter. "Vincent was supposed to collect, not pocket what he gathered." "How much money?" "I'm not exactly sure, but it was enough to make Anton think it was worth sending me all the way to Montana to get it back. All expenses paid, too." He glanced out of the window, not seeing Ellie and Silas, who were off to the side slightly. "I considered making a break for it and having a clean start out here, but the frontier life isn't for me. Too many busybodies sticking their noses into everyone's business." "Well, you'll certainly be having a clean start," Sheriff Jarman said curtly. "In prison for a good few years. The traveling judge won't look kindly on kidnapping a helpless infant and causing such anguish to her mother." "I had to do something. It's a lot of money. That's all I know." Jonah cleared his throat. Ellie felt Silas tense beside her. She knew he was thinking the same thing she was. If that much money was involved, Anton Cawley wouldn't give up easily. "Where did Mr. Durant hide it?" the sheriff continued. "If I knew that, do you think I'd still be here?" Jonah snapped. "All I know is what I was told. Vincent sent a letter to his wife before he died, saying he'd hidden it with someone he trusted. That's why I needed to find her." "And you believed threatening an innocent woman and kidnapping a baby was acceptable?" Jonah shrugged coldly. "I believed getting results was what mattered. I'm not going back to Baltimore empty-handed to face Anton Cawley's disappointment." "Let me remind you again that you're not going back to Baltimore at all," Sheriff Jarman said firmly. "You'll be going to the territorial prison for kidnapping and extortion." Jonah's face darkened. "You can't hold me forever. And when I don't report back, Anton will send someone else. Someone who might not be as considerate as I was. I gave that silly woman plenty of chances. She only has herself to blame." Ellie shuddered at his words. Even after everything he'd done, Jonah still considered his actions were justified. What would the next person be like? Sheriff Jarman stood up. "Let them come. We'll be ready." Jonah cleared his throat and lowered his voice. "Surely we can strike a deal, Sheriff. Why don't you help me find the money and take a share of it? Anton would never need to know. You'll be better off, and I'll head to California under a new name." Ellie gasped at the man's audacity and was glad to hear the sheriff's snort of amusement. "Nice try, Mr. Bell. Maybe that sort of thing works in Baltimore, but it sure doesn't here. You'll get the jail time you deserve." As the questioning ended, Silas guided Ellie away from the window. "I've heard enough," he said quietly. "Let's go home." They walked back toward the store in thoughtful silence. News of the kidnapping had spread like wildfire, and several of the townsfolk hurried across the street to ask if there was anything they could do to support Ellie, asking after Clara and expressing relief that the ordeal was over. "People are so kind," she said, once they got home, and she was taking off her bonnet. "That's just what folks are like here. We're a close-knit community." "How did it go?" Dora asked, looking up from where she was getting a freshly baked loaf of bread out of the oven. "Jonah didn't tell the sheriff much more than we already know," Silas replied, "but he confirmed that others might come looking for Eleanor." "Ellie," she corrected automatically. "Eleanor Durant is left behind in Baltimore. I'm Ellie Warren now." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. The past couldn't be erased simply by changing her name. Vincent's crimes still cast a shadow over her future, and the money he'd supposedly stolen remained a mystery that could bring more danger to the people she loved. "Sophie's having a nap," Dora said. "The poor child was exhausted from yesterday's worry. She keeps blaming herself for not being strong enough to stop that terrible man." "I'll talk to her when she wakes up," Ellie said, her heart aching for the little girl who had tried so hard to protect Clara. After Dora bustled away to collect the eggs, Ellie and Silas found themselves alone in the store with Clara. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but Ellie felt restless and troubled. "Silas," she said finally, settling Clara in her crib behind the counter. "I need to tell you something. The whole truth this time." He looked up from the inventory he'd been checking. "What do you mean?" Ellie took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. "I haven't been completely honest with you about Vincent and what happened in Baltimore. There are things I didn't tell you because I was afraid you would turn me away." Silas set down his ledger and gave her his full attention. "I'm listening." "Vincent wasn't just involved with dangerous men," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was one of them. He used threats and violence to collect money from business owners who refused to pay for protection. And I think he was skimming money from those collections for longer than even Anton realized. He used to talk about it in his sleep. It never made sense to me at the time, but now it does." "What did he use it for?" She shrugged helplessly. "Not for anything good. Gambling debts would be my best guess. I certainly never saw any of it, which I'm glad about. It would be terrible to think I'd inadvertently profited from other people's misery." She told him about Vincent's growing paranoia, about the night she realized he'd beaten a merchant so badly the man couldn't work for weeks. She told him about Anton Cawley's visit, about the specific threats against Clara, about her desperate flight from Baltimore. "I kept thinking Anton had gotten it wrong, but the scraps of the letter you showed me from Vincent make me think he did steal money from them. A lot of money, enough to make it worth sending Jonah all this way to find me." She bowed her head. "I'm sorry, Silas. I know it's not enough, but I truly am. You, Sophie, and Dora didn't deserve to get swept up in this. I should never have come." Throughout her confession, Silas remained silent, his expression unreadable. Ellie's heart pounded as she waited for his reaction. And shame washed over her. Would he be disgusted by her association with such violence? Would he worry about the danger she'd brought to his family? Have I ruined everything? How can I hope for a kind, honest man like Silas to love me now? The thoughts were almost enough to make her want to pack her bag and run away with Clara again. When she finished speaking, Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then, to her amazement, he simply reached across the space between them and took her hands in his. "Ellie," he said softly, "you were a victim in all of this. Vincent's crimes are not your crimes. His choices are not your responsibility." "But I brought this danger to your home," she protested, tears pricking her eyes. "Jonah could have hurt you and Sophie both because of me, which is unforgivable." "Jonah Bell made his own choices," Silas said firmly. "You didn't ask him to come here. You didn't ask for any of this. You were just trying to protect your daughter and build a better life." "What if more men come? What if they're worse than Jonah? Then we'll face them together," Silas said. "But Ellie, I need you to understand something. I don't care about Vincent's crimes or the money he stole. I don't care about your past or what name you were born with. I only care about who you are now, and the woman you are now is someone I He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Someone you what? Ellie whispered. Someone I love, he said simply. I love your courage, your devotion to Clara, your kindness to Sophie and Dora. I love the way you've brought laughter and happiness back into this house, the way you've made us all remember what it feels like to be a family. Ellie stared at him in amazement. You love me? Even knowing everything? Especially knowing everything, Silas replied, because now I know just how strong and brave you really are. Before Ellie could respond, they heard footsteps and Sheriff Jarman appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but I wanted to speak with you both. Of course, Silas said, though he didn't release Ellie's hands. What can we do for you? I've been thinking about what Jonah Bell said about others possibly coming. I want you to know that I've sent word to the local marshals about this situation. If anyone else shows up in Cottonwood Creek asking questions about Ellie Durant, we'll be ready for them. He paused, looking directly at Ellie. Mrs. Warren, I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, you've done nothing wrong. You're not responsible for your husband's crimes, and you won't face any charges from me or any other lawman in this territory. Ellie felt a weight she didn't even know she'd been carrying lift from her shoulders. Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know. You're one of us now, Sheriff Jarman said with a kind smile. Cottonwood Creek looks after its own. After the sheriff left, Ellie and Silas stood looking at each other in the quiet store. Clara gurgled contentedly in her crib, and somewhere upstairs, Sophie was sleeping peacefully. For the first time since Jonah's arrival, Ellie felt truly safe. Ellie, Silas said, his voice suddenly nervous, there's something else I need to tell you. What is it? I know this might seem sudden, given everything that's happened, but I don't want to waste any more time. He took both her hands in his and looked directly into her eyes. I love you, and I want to marry you. Not because you need protection, or because Clara needs a father, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Silas, I know you came here as my housekeeper, and I know we haven't known each other very long, but these past weeks have shown me what happiness can feel like again. You and Clara have become part of my heart, just like Sophie and Dora. Will you marry me, Ellie? Will you be my wife? Tears streamed down Ellie's face as she looked at this good, kind man who was offering her everything she'd never dared to hope for. A real family. A home where she was loved and valued. Safety not just for Clara, but for herself. Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes, Silas, I love you too, and being your wife and one day a mother to Sophie, I hope, will be a great honor. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as she blinked back her tears of joy and relief. After so many months of fear and uncertainty, she had found something she never expected. True love. I love you, she said again, looking deep into his eyes. I didn't think I'd ever be able to trust again, but you've shown me what a good man can be. You've given me a family, a home, a future I never thought possible. We'll face whatever comes together, Silas murmured into her hair. No more running, no more hiding. This is where you belong now. Their lips met in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, making her heart skip a beat. As they held each other in the warm safety of the store, Ellie knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as a family. Jonah Bell was locked away, and while other threats might come, she was no longer facing them alone. She had found her place in the world at last, and no one would ever take it away from her again. Chapter 10. 3 weeks had passed since Silas proposed, and Ellie could hardly believe how quickly the days had flown by. The snow had continued to fall intermittently, blanketing Cottonwood Creek in a pristine white that made everything look like a winter fairy tale. Christmas was approaching, and with it, their wedding day. Pastor Fernandez had agreed to marry them on Christmas Eve, saying it would be a perfect way to celebrate the season of hope and new beginnings. The whole town seemed excited about the upcoming ceremony, with neighbors stopping by daily to offer help with preparations or to bring small gifts for the celebration. Now, standing in her small room above the store, Ellie tried to calm her nerves as she prepared for her wedding day. In just a few hours, she would become Mrs. Reed. The thought filled her with joy, but also with a flutter of anxiety. She wanted everything to be perfect. Sophie had been beside herself with excitement all morning, helping Clara play with the wooden blocks Silas had carved for her while chattering non-stop about the wedding. "Will you really be my new mama after today?" Sophie asked for the 100th time, her gap-toothed grin lighting up her face. She hesitated for a moment. "Sometimes I can't remember my first mama very well, but I think she would have liked you." "If you'll have me," Ellie replied, smoothing down the little girl's fair hair. "I would be honored to be your mama, Sophie. And as for your first mama, a part of her will always live on in you, and that makes me very happy." Clara, now 8 months old and sitting up on her own, clapped her hands and babbled happily, as if she understood the importance of the day. "Dora says you're going to look like a princess," Sophie continued, "and she made me a special blue sash to match Clara's for the ceremony." She ran to the window and peeked out. "It's snowing again. Does that mean I'll have to wear my old coat over my dress?" "Where is your pretty blue sash now?" Ellie asked, looking around the room. "Downstairs with Dora. She's pressing it with the iron to make sure it looks perfect." Sophie bounced on her toes. "Can I help you get ready, please?" "Of course, sweetheart. I was just about to look for my mother's shawl to wear with my dress, but I have a better idea. It was very special to me. But how about you wear it around your shoulders for when we're in the church?" "Really?" Sophie's eyes rounded with delight. "That would be a little bit like your mama being at the wedding." "Exactly. Even the special people who aren't with us in person anymore will be with us in spirit. Let's get it out of my carpet bag. What with everything that's been going on, I never unpacked it." Ellie had figured that if she and Clara had ever needed to leave Cottonwood Creek in a hurry, it was best to leave a few items still packed in the bag, just in case. But she didn't want to tell Sophie that it had been a small act driven by a lingering fear of not quite daring to believe her future lay in Cottonwood Creek with Silas. She knew better than that now. Ellie crossed the bedroom and pulled the bag she'd carried all the way from Baltimore out from under her bed. Her heart lifted with happiness that today she would finally unpack everything and truly settle in as Silas's wife. The bag was heavier than she remembered as she lifted it onto the small bed, and she marveled at how she had managed it with Clara as well on the steam train. She unfastened the leather straps and began carefully removing her last few belongings. There were the few extra clothes she'd brought, Clara's baby things, and her Bible. At the bottom, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, should be her mother's blue silk shawl. "What's that?" Sophie asked, pointing to a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Ellie's mother. "It has my mother's earrings in it," Ellie explained, opening it to show Sophie the simple pearl drops. "I thought I might wear them today." "They're beautiful. Your mama must have been very pretty." "She was," Ellie said softly. "I wish she could be here today to meet you and Clara and see how happy I am." She continued searching through the bag, and just as she pulled the shawl out, her fingers brushed against something strange in the lining, something that felt hard and lumpy. "That's odd," she murmured, running her hand along the edge of the bag. "What's odd?" Sophie asked, trying to peer into the bag. "There's something sewn into the lining here. It feels like—" Ellie pressed against the strange bulge, trying to identify what it could be. Whatever it was definitely not supposed to be there. Her heart began to race as a terrible suspicion formed in her mind. Vincent's letter had mentioned hiding something valuable with the person he most trusted. She had always assumed he had meant one of his business associates. But what if he hadn't meant another person at all? What if he'd meant me and hid the money without my knowledge? Her mouth went dry. "Sophie, could you fetch your pa and bring Dora's sewing scissors?" "Does it matter if Pa sees you in your wedding dress?" "No, this is more important." Ellie couldn't wait until later. She had to know what was in the bag with Silas by her side. "Of course!" Sophie scampered out of the room, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards, and returned a moment later. "Pa said he'll come just as soon as he's gotten dressed." She giggled. "He looks strange in his new shirt." Ellie's hands trembled as she examined the carpet bag more closely. The lining had been carefully opened and restitched along one seam so skillfully that she'd never noticed it before. The stitching was different from the original work, neater and more precise. Vincent had always been good with his hands when he wasn't drinking. Her heart pounded as she carefully snipped the stitching to reveal a small, hidden pocket sewn into the lining. "What's in there?" Sophie whispered, as fascinated as if they were opening a treasure chest. Ellie reached into the bag's lining and her fingers closed around something. She pulled out a velvet pouch and opened the drawstring, tipping the contents into her hand. "Oh, Vincent, no wonder Anton was so angry." 4 diamonds lay in her palm, and she gasped as they caught the light, sparkling with an inner fire that took her breath away. "Pretty pebbles, but not very big," Sophie exclaimed, reaching out to touch one. "Oh, Sophie," Ellie breathed, sinking down onto the bed. "These aren't rocks. These are diamonds. Very valuable diamonds." The truth hit her like a physical blow. This was Vincent's stolen treasure. This was what Jonah Bell and Anton Colley had been looking for. Vincent had hidden it in her carpet bag, sewn into the lining where she would never think to look. She had been carrying a fortune in stolen goods all the way from Baltimore, completely unaware. "But why are they in your bag?" Sophie asked innocently. "My late husband put them there before he died," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He stole money from some very bad men, and I think he must have exchanged the money for diamonds so they would be easier to conceal. He hid them here because he knew I would keep the bag safe and take it wherever I moved to." The full implication began to sink in. Vincent had made her an unwitting accomplice to his crimes. She had fled Baltimore carrying stolen goods and had lived in Silas's house for months with stolen property in her possession. What would Silas think? What would Sheriff Jarman say? "Ellie, are you okay? Do you need help getting your wedding gown on?" Dora bustled into the bedroom, took one look at Ellie's pale face and the diamonds in her hand, and immediately understood that something was very wrong. "Dear Lord, what have you found?" "The stolen money," Ellie said numbly. "Or rather, what Vincent converted it into. He hid diamonds in my carpet bag and I never knew." Dora moved closer, her eyes widening as she peered at the sparkling gems. "Well, I'll be, so that's what all the fuss was about." "I have to tell Silas," Ellie said, standing up abruptly. "I have to tell him right away. Our wedding. I can't marry him with stolen goods in my possession. What if the law comes after me? What if they think I was part of Vincent's schemes?" "Now, hold on," Dora said firmly. "You didn't know those were there. You're as much a victim as anyone else. But I was carrying them. All this time, I've been living here with stolen property." Ellie gave a hollow laugh as she paced the room. "What a fool I've been. All those times I told Jonah and Sheriff Jarman I didn't have the money, but I had it all along. How can I marry Silas knowing this? How can I bring this kind of trouble into his life?" "By telling him the truth," Dora said simply. "Which is exactly what you're going to do, and then you're going to let him help you figure out what to do next." Sophie, who had been listening wide-eyed to this conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Are you not going to marry Pa now? Because of the pretty rocks? Please don't leave us." The distress in the little girl's voice cut through Ellie's panic. She knelt down in front of Sophie, taking her small hands. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't know. I want to marry your father more than anything in the world, but these diamonds are from money stolen from good people. I have to make sure Vincent's crimes are put right." "But Pa loves you," Sophie said earnestly, "and you love him. Love is more important than pretty rocks, isn't it?" Her chin trembled and tears pooled in her eyes. "What about Clara? I love having a little sister." Out of the mouths of babes, Ellie thought. Sophie was right, of course. Love was more important than anything else. But would Silas's love survive this revelation? "You're both right," Ellie said, standing up with new determination and glancing worriedly at Dora. "I need to find your father right now and tell him what I've discovered." She slipped the diamonds carefully back in the pouch and headed downstairs with Dora and Sophie following close behind. Silas was just peering into the mirror to make sure his shirt collar was straight and his hair was smoothed down. "Silas," she said, her voice shaking, "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." He looked up at her pale face and immediately strode to her side. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Ellie said. She tipped the diamonds onto her hand again, her breath catching in her throat. "I found these hidden in my carpet bag just now. sewn into the lining where I never would have looked. He stared at them in shock. You think they're real? Yes, this is Vincent's stolen treasure, she confirmed. I've been carrying them all this time without knowing it. I've been living in your house with stolen goods, preparing to marry you while harboring evidence of my husband's crimes. Silas gave her a searching look, and Ellie held her breath, waiting for his reaction. Would he be angry? Disappointed? Would he call off the wedding? Instead, he reached out and took her free hand in his. You didn't know they were there. But they were in my possession, Ellie protested. What if people think I was involved? What if they think I came here planning to use stolen money to start a new life? Then they don't know you at all, Silas said firmly. Anyone who has spent 5 minutes with you knows you're not capable of such deception. What do we do now? Ellie asked, her voice small and uncertain. We take them to Sheriff Jarman immediately, Silas said without hesitation. We explain exactly how you found them and let him handle returning them, or the money used to buy them, to their rightful owners. But our wedding will happen exactly as planned, Silas said with a happy grin. This doesn't change anything between us, Ellie. If anything, it makes me love you more for your honesty and integrity. You still want to marry me, even with all this trouble? Silas cupped her face in his hands and looked directly into her eyes. I want to marry you, especially because of how you're handling this trouble. Another person might have hidden the diamonds or tried to keep them, but not you. Your first instinct was to tell the truth and make things right. That's the woman I fell in love with. She released a long breath of relief and gratitude. I love you so much, Silas. And I love you. Now, let's go see Sheriff Jarman and put this whole business behind us once and for all. 20 minutes later, they sat in Sheriff Jarman's office, the diamonds spread out on his desk. The sheriff examined them carefully, occasionally picking one up to study it in the light. A pot of coffee was warming on the stove in the corner, and the smell of cinnamon cookies wafted from a basket of food his wife had just delivered. Well, isn't this a turn-up for the books? He said finally, muttering something else under his breath. Pardon my language, Mrs. Warren, but these are worth a considerable sum. No wonder Jonah Bell and his associates were so determined to find them. What happens now? Ellie asked nervously, resisting looking toward the cells out the back. Now I begin the process of putting all of this right, Sheriff Jarman said with a chuckle, still looking bemused. I'll contact the authorities in Baltimore, find out which businesses were robbed, and arrange for restitution. It'll take some time, but justice will be served. And Ellie? Silas asked. Will there be any charges against her? Sheriff Jarman looked at Ellie with kind eyes. Mrs. Warren, you've just voluntarily turned over evidence that could have made you wealthy. You've provided information that will help us return stolen property to its rightful owners. I see absolutely no reason to pursue any charges against you. In fact, I'd say you're a hero in all this. Ellie felt as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Thank you, Sheriff. I can't tell you what a relief that is. Now, I believe you two have a wedding to get to, Sheriff Jarman said with a smile. Don't let me keep you from your happiness any longer. As they walked back through town, past the store and onward to the white church where the pastor was waiting for them, Ellie felt lighter than she had in months. The secret was finally out. The stolen goods were in the proper hands, and she was free to marry the man she loved without any shadows from her past. Are you ready to become Mrs. Reed? Silas asked, squeezing her hand. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, Ellie replied, her heart full of joy and anticipation for the future they would build together. Dora and Sophie were waiting by the church's wooden gate, and Ellie lifted Clara from Dora's arms and settled her on her hip. The bell rang out, and neighbors called out cheerful greetings as they arrived for the service just as it started to snow again. I think this is the most perfect day ever, Sophie exclaimed. She skipped ahead of them, eager for the ceremony to begin, and Dora hobbled after her. Silas slowed, pausing to face her, and Ellie's heart pitter-pattered at how much she loved him. I agree with Sophie, he murmured with a wry smile. It sure is perfect, and it certainly has been the strangest day we've had for, let's see, a few weeks. I promise life will be more ordinary now, she said, laughter bubbling up. I hope you won't think it's too ordinary. With you and Clara, never. He brushed some snowflakes from her hair. Shall we get married, my dear Ellie? Will you take me to be your husband, and I promise to cherish you and Clara forevermore? I will, she said, her heart swelling with joy. The church bells rang out over Cottonwood Creek, and the snowflakes fell from the sky, swirling in the breeze. Epilogue. 5 months later, the spring air drifted through the open door of Reed's General Store, carrying with it the sweet scent of cherry blossoms and the promise of warmer days ahead. Ellie hummed softly as she arranged a display of the new spices they had begun getting from one of the importers in Baltimore, marveling at how different her life had become since that snowy Christmas Eve when she'd become Mrs. Reed. The bell above the door tinkled, and she looked up to see Sheriff Jarman removing his hat as he stepped inside. His weathered face broke into a broad smile when he spotted her. "Good morning, Mrs. Reed. Is your husband about? I've got some news from back east that I think you'll both want to hear." Ellie's heart skipped a beat, and she called toward the back room. "Silas? Sheriff Jarman is here." Silas emerged from the storeroom, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Sheriff, what brings you here today? I hope everything is okay?" "Well now," Sheriff Jarman said, settling his hat on the counter, "I've been corresponding with some trustworthy officers back in Baltimore, and I've got good news about that business we wrapped up last winter." Ellie moved closer to Silas, who reached out and took her hand reassuringly. Even though the sheriff was bringing good news, her stomach still clenched with anxiety at the mention of those terrifying events. She no longer had nightmares about Clara being kidnapped, but suspected a grain of fear might always linger somewhere in the recesses of her mind. "Anton Colley has been arrested and is now sitting in a Baltimore prison cell where he belongs," the sheriff continued. "And they tracked down the diamond merchant who Vincent dealt with. He very kindly offered to buy them back at the same cost, and every last cent from those diamonds has been returned to the hardworking warehouse owners at the docks." Thank goodness. Ellie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, with a whoosh of relief, and instantly felt lighter. Those poor men deserved to get their money back. "That they did," Sheriff Jarman agreed. "And the officers are making regular trips to the docks to make sure no other criminal starts a new protection racket now that Mr. Colley is off the scene. I'm so grateful we don't have to worry about that sort of thing in Cottonwood Creek." Silas glanced around his store, and Ellie squeezed his hand to signal she felt the same. They worked hard to keep the place feeling homey and welcoming to locals and newcomers alike. And she was proud of how the business was growing. "But here's the interesting part," the sheriff continued. "Those warehouse owners offered a substantial reward for the return of their stolen money, and they're insisting that you accept it, Mrs. Reed." Ellie's eyes widened. "A reward? But I can't possibly accept money for just doing what was right." "Now, I figured you might say that," Sheriff Jarman chuckled. "But this is a significant amount we're talking about. These men are grateful, and they won't take no for an answer." Ellie looked up at Silas, full of uncertainty. "What do you think I should do? I'd hate for people to think I'd profited in any way from those terrible events. It wouldn't sit right with me." Silas gave her a steady smile. "What does your heart tell you?" She was quiet for a moment, then brightened. "Could we make a large contribution to the church? And perhaps help some of the other families in town who might be struggling? There are always folks who could do with a helping hand to get them through a challenging time, and the school teacher said they needed new books." Sheriff Jarman nodded in approval. "I wrote back and told those Baltimore gentlemen you'd probably say something just like that. They said they figured as much from a woman with your character. I'd feel better knowing the money was being put to good use." Silas smiled again. "That's why I love you, Ellie. You think of others and what's best for the town. It's a noble gesture, but the gentlemen in Baltimore were quite insistent that you should keep a little for yourself, Mrs. Reed." The sheriff pulled a letter from his vest pocket. "I hope you don't mind, but I happen to know that it's always been Silas's dream to build a log cabin on this land to have a proper home for his family." Ellie felt a flutter of excitement at the idea, and for more reasons than Silas knew yet. It's something we talk about, she admitted. Well, they said that as well as using the money for charitable deeds, you must keep some of it to put toward building that log cabin of yours. Silas's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. They said that? They did indeed, said any woman with the integrity to turn over stolen goods and then try to give away the reward deserves to have her family's dreams come true. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes. That's incredibly generous of them. So you'll accept the reward money then? Sheriff Jarman asked with a knowing smile. Ellie looked at Silas, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, she said softly. We'll accept it gratefully. I'll have them sort it all out at the bank if you come and see me tomorrow. Sheriff Jarman picked up his hat and headed for the door. Mama Ellie, Papa! Sophie's voice rang out from the back door. Come quick, Clara's doing something wonderful. We'll be right there, sweetheart, Silas called back, then turned to shake Sheriff Jarman's hand. Thank you for everything you've done, for all of us. Just doing my job, the sheriff replied, settling his hat back on his head. Though I have to say, it's not often I get to deliver such happy news. You folks enjoy this beautiful day. Hand in hand, Ellie and Silas hurried through the store toward the back door, where they could hear Sophie's excited chatter and Dora's encouraging voice. They stepped outside into the sunshine. Their new kitchen garden was already taking shape, and the cherry tree was in full bloom, its delicate pink petals drifting down like confetti in the gentle breeze. Dora was kneeling on a blanket spread beneath the tree, her arms outstretched, while Clara stood wobbling on unsteady legs a few feet away. Look, look! Sophie danced around them, clapping her hands. Clara's going to walk. She's been standing up all by herself. Ellie hurried forward and knelt down beside Dora, her heart racing with anticipation. Come on, sweet girl, she cooed. Can you walk to Mama? Clara's bright blue eyes fixed on Ellie's face, and with a determined expression took one tentative step, then another. Her chubby arms windmilled for balance as she tottered forward, and on the fifth step, she tumbled safely into Ellie's waiting arms. Oh, Clara! Ellie laughed as she scooped her up and covered her face with kisses. What a blessing to see you take your first steps today of all days. She stood up again, and Clara reached for the blossom fluttering overhead. Did you see, Papa? Our Clara walked. I've been encouraging her for days. Silas wrapped his arms around both Ellie and Clara, his own eyes bright with emotion. I saw it, sweetheart. Our little Clara is growing up, and you're a wonderful big sister to her. Dora dabbed a few tears of happiness away with the corner of her apron, beaming with pride. I think this calls for a celebration. Sophie, let's go bake a lemon cake, shall we? Ellie leaned into Silas's embrace, feeling overwhelmed by the completeness of this moment. Just over a year ago, she had been living a life of fear and uncertainty, fighting the knowledge that Vincent wasn't a good man, but helpless to do anything about it. Now she was hundreds of miles away in Cottonwood Creek, surrounded by the family she had found and the love she had never dared to hope for. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Silas murmured against her hair. That we're the most blessed people in all of Montana? She whispered back. Yes, we are. He pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. Who would have thought that a mail-order bride advertisement would lead to all this? Ellie smiled up at him, her heart full to overflowing. Perhaps the best treasures aren't the ones we search for, but the ones that find us when we least expect them. Mama Ellie, will you tell us the story tonight about the princess who found her castle? Sophie asked as she skipped away after Dora. Of course, Ellie replied, jiggling Clara on her hip. Though I think the story had a much better ending than I ever imagined it would. I think in today's story, the princess would say that not only did she find a family to treasure, but also another baby to welcome into the world sometime in fall. Are you sure? Silas said, his eyes beaming with delight. A new baby? Dora chimed in, clasping her hands together. Yes, our family is growing, Ellie chuckled. God has blessed us many times over, and his blessings are even more abundant than I ever dreamed of. The greatest treasure of my life has been finding you, Silas, and all the years ahead we have to grow old together. I love you, Ellie, he grinned. You keep us on our toes, especially with today's surprise, but I wouldn't have it any other way. As she leaned against Silas, safe in his tender embrace, Ellie marveled at how everything had worked out. The stolen money that had once represented her greatest fear would end up benefiting the townsfolk in the place she now called home. And although she had never expected a reward, soon they would build the log cabin Silas had always dreamed of, and they would fill it with love, laughter, and the promise of many more joyous times together, just like this one. The cherry blossoms drifted around them like nature's own celebration, and Ellie knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her place in the world. She was home. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.